Good morning, everyone. For those who are in the Americas, good afternoon for those in Europe, Africa, and elsewhere who are with us today. Welcome, dear friends and colleagues, to this webinar on gender provisions in peace accords, reflections on negotiation, design, and implementation in support of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. Thank you to all our speakers who have accepted this invitation to present and engage in conversations. This webinar responds to the Kroc Institute's commitment to intersectionality by looking at the ways in which race, class, and gender, among other identity categories, create interlocking systems of privilege and oppression. Intersectional peace building seeks to identify these dimensions and cultivate the causes and conditions for justice, equality, and dignity for the most vulnerable, as well as to build bridges of affinity and solidarity. My name is Josefina Chavarria, and I'm an associate professor of the practice and director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute, located at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. The Peace Accords Matrix, shortly PAM, is a unique source of data on the implementation of more than 30 comprehensive peace agreements negotiated since 1989. PAM provides academic research on peace accords and their implementation, and also offers practical information and technical support to stakeholders like policymakers, facilitators, and peace builders. One of PAM's central features is the Barometer Initiative in Colombia, which received a mandate by the signatory parties to monitor in real time the implementation of the 2016 Colombian Peace Accord between the Colombian government and the former guerrillas FARC-EP. Although PAM's work also extends to other locations like South Sudan and Mindanao, you will hear plenty about Colombia and the Barometer today. I am delighted to have PRIO as partner for this webinar. PRIO is a world-renowned institute for research on the conditions for peaceful relations between states, groups, and people. My co-convener, Dr. Louise Olson, has done research on gender aspects of armed conflict and its resolution since the end of the 1990s, and is now a senior researcher at the Gender Research Group at PRIO. PRIO also hosts the Gender, Peace and Conflict Center, funded by the Norwegian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, contributing to PRIO becoming a hub for studying various forms of gender aspects related to peace, security, and armed conflict. We will have today a seminar engaging not only with the design, but also with the implementation of gender provisions and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in peace accords. The first panel will shed light on negotiation, and the second panel on this new phase of implementation. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Josefina, for that kind introduction. PRIO is very happy to be a partner with the Peace Accord Matrix program at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And we particularly think that this is a very timely event, as 1325 turns 20 in just a few weeks. As the Secretary General has expressed the need to move from rhetorics to impactful action, on WPS and sort of understanding how to turn the different explicit commitments made on gender equality and women, peace and security into action. We are really happy to work with you on this event, as your research really contributes to understanding how and what it takes to move in that direction. So let me also join you in expressing a very warm welcome to our audience. I'm glad to see that so many has been able to join us for this event today. And I really also look forward to the question and answers at the end of the panel. So please submit your questions in the chat function. And I will do my very best to distribute the word to our distinguished panelists, who I am really also grateful to for taking your time to share both practical experiences and the research results that speak to this topic. So I think throughout the seminar we will have a really thought-provoking and substantive discussion on these quite tricky issues. So that leads me to the specific purpose of this panel, which we will then focus on sort of the approach to understanding negotiations and accord design processes more in depth. And we will try, as the UN Secretary General has encouraged, to place women's participation at the center and focus on how to realize the commitments then made on gender equality and women's rights. So our panelists will reflect on these from several different complementary perspectives: that of the state party in the negotiation, that of us external states supporting negotiations, and on the role of the mediator and the mediator mandate. And in addition to that, we will sort of place this in sort of terms of a context of broader depth, where we go more in depth into gender provisions and what we can learn from processes where gender provisions has been successfully included. So in that way, we also hope that this will place sort of a good foundation for the continued discussion then on implementation in panel 2. So with that short introduction of the panel and the format, I turn to our panelists. The first presentation is by Juanita Milan, who is currently the Senior Mediator Advisor in the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs Standby Team of Mediation Advisors. Today, however, Juanita will describe what it can practically mean to promote WPS and gender provisions in negotiation, as she was part of the Colombian state delegation during the negotiation of the final peace accord. So we much look forward to that. Please, Juanita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luis. And welcome, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here in this important event in the commemoration of the 1325 resolution. Let me share my screen to start. Let's see. Is it looking? Can you see it? Yes. So I'm going to talk about how the gender provisions were included in the Colombian peace process. Just a few facts about the Colombian peace process to begin with. One important issue is that we had direct negotiations. We didn't use a format of mediation, but direct negotiations between the government and FARC. We had the class of negotiating while fighting, so no preliminary ceasefires, bilaterals. FARC stated a few unilateral ceasefires, but not bilateral. The talks were held in Cuba, as you can see in the graphic. And we had the class of nothing was agreed until everything was agreed. We had a tailored involvement of international organizations, so very honor process from the parties, and a lot of rules regulating the confidentiality of the talks, meaning that for several months, all the process were kept in secret, and then in the public phase, still the information was very controlled by the parties in order to kind of secure the process at the beginning. The agenda was these 6 points: a comprehensive rural reform, political participation, end of the conflict, which means kind of ceasefire DDR issues, solution of the problem of illicit drugs, victims, and a last point of implementation and verification of the process. This is how the format and venue of the peace process looked at the beginning, with a very discreet participation from civil society, only through a webpage and written proposals. 5 negotiators from FARC and 5 from the government, with a team of 4 in total to support, with the experts advising the parties and the guarantors on the table. But their role were kind of discreet. They were only there kind of as a witness. Then I wanted to show you this to see how the process started to change. One thing happened in October 2012, and is this cover of Semana magazine, a very important one in Colombia, and it says "The Men of Peace." So this magazine kind of, I guess, pissed off all of Colombian women, even in the government delegations and in the FARC delegations, because we were already in the process. But this kind of triggered a huge effort from civil society organizations, especially women organizations, to start advocating and pressuring the parties and the government to start including more women in the front line of the negotiations. So the first outcome, and this is how everything started to change, was this. Thanks to the pressure from civil society organizations that joined together in the Cumbre Nacional de Mujeres to really have a joint effort to influence the peace talks. So one of the first outcomes is that the two delegations decided to appoint two women as negotiators, two from the FARC side and two from the government side. This is the two head of the gender subcommission, Maura Paulina Rivers on the left and Victoria Sandino from FARC. And this is how everything started to happen. From 2013, as you can see in the graphic, everything started to change from the two green dots on the table, meaning two female negotiators, but still women in the delegations and women in civil society kept saying that this was not enough, that the outcome of the first drafts of the agreements were not reflecting the gender issues that were needed to be included. So they kept pressuring, and also inside the delegations, a process of searching for experts, searching for advice on how to do this started. So as an outcome, in 2014, the gender subcommission on the left was established with kind of 97% of women, 6 from FARC and 6 from the government. I was part of the gender subcommission, and another commission, the End of the Conflict Commission, to design the ceasefire. At the end of the process, the civil society participation had changed a lot, and regional forums were stated, and to gather huge amounts of people, around 4,000, 5,000 people for each point in Colombia. So they will gather and give their advice and support and demands to the peace table, and those proposals were sent to Havana. Then the parties will analyze these proposals and include it into their negotiations. So at the end of the process, more than 40% of women were part of the two delegations. You could see on the right side the amount of web page participations, the written proposals, the forums, and one important issue was the victims going to Havana to talk to the parties. And 36 out of 60 victims were women, very strong women that went to Havana to talk to the parties. This is the gender subcommission. On the left, the mandate. Our mandate was to revise the 3 topics that were already agreed and make sure that the gender inclusion was done, and then make sure that in the remaining issues that were about to start being negotiated, the gender inclusion was done. So on the picture on the top is the members from FARC, and on down, the members from the government. Not all of them were part of the gender subcommission, but they were part of the delegations. So when we started working, the picture on that you see is us in the gender subcommission working. So this was a very different format than the other ones, the main table or the ceasefire table. We were more like a team because we tried to find a common goal, which was that men and women participated and benefit in equal conditions from the peace agreement. We tried to include measures to overcome inequality and stigmatization. We tried to do the introduction of inclusive language, provisions to compensate the impact that the armed conflict have had on men and women, strategies to promote the empowerment of women, and instruments of transitional justice. So it was a very beautiful space in which at the end we kind of work as a team. And in the picture you can see we are all mixed. We also had few men, as you can see, but at the end we work more like a team that are antagonist conflict parties negotiating. We became a team. And how this happened I guess on my understanding and from my experience, the main source of influence and ideas and proposals and demands were the proposals from civil society organizations, especially women organizations. Then the initiatives from the parties, us thinking on what was the main issues that we needed to include into the peace agreement, and also a lot of advice from experts, national and internationals. We had the support from Sweden, from Norway, nationals, Cuba, a lot of help from everybody, and a lot of research that the government and FARC did to specifically find what were the main issues and specifically technical issues that we needed to include into the text. Then all of this information will be analyzed by the Gender Commission, then included into the text, then submitted into the main table, and then the inclusion was done into the text. These are a few pictures from the civil society organizations' visits to Havana and the exchange that we had. Also, on down, the victims were at the center of the process, so they were very present from from 2015 until the end. They were very, very active in the visits to Havana to advise the parties. At the end, and I'm sure my next colleagues will talk about how this is being implemented, but at the end, we managed to have more than 122 measures in each, in all around the peace agreement. And as you know, it's a long text of 310 pages long, but the gender provisions and measures are all around the text. So we are very proud of that. And to finish, I wanted to give you some ideas on what I think were the good practices from this process. One, the thing that started all was the pressure from civil society organizations, especially women organizations. Then the formal appointment of women negotiators was a huge win for us, women in Colombia. The creation of a mandate of the Gender Subcommission, the permanent support from gender experts, national and internationals, the fact that we find a way to work together as a team, finding a common goal between members from the FARC and the government, the active participation of women in all areas of the negotiation. The whole process was, you could see women everywhere working in very important issues. The large representation of women in the two delegations, the inclusion of language and affirmative measures at the end of the text, the training of the parties, which I think is very important, to engage men in this and show them the importance and the benefits of women participation and inclusion and the provisions, the institutional and gender architecture for implementation, and the indicators to measure the implementation of the gender provisions, meaning the Kroc Institute involvement and all of the architecture that was designed to implement the process. So this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juanita. It's a very important perspective of the state. I mean, in the resolutions, this is very much sort of highlighted, the role of the states for realizing WPS. And I think in research, this is still fairly underdeveloped. So it was a fantastic insights. Thank you so much for that. The second presentation will also take a state perspective, but this time we will look at more the external support by a state to a negotiation process and design process, where Marita Sørheim-Rensvik, the Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security at the Norwegian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, will be sharing Norway's experiences with supporting peace negotiations and agreement design, and also shortly outline how Norway is planning to address these issues as you enter into the Security Council in just a few months, which is really exciting. Please, Marita, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Hello, Luisa. I've been told that I cannot turn my camera on because it's been turned off by someone.
Oy, okay. Lisa, can you help with this? Unfortunately, I can't help you either.
I'm okay speaking without a
Yes,
picture
you can
as
start
well.
speaking and then we'll try to fix it. I'm sure Lisa is trying to fix it right now.
I'm sure she is. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you. And thank you, Juanita, for an incredibly interesting presentation that, you know, is in a way close to our heart because we follow the Colombia process so closely. And we too have been very impressed with what the Colombian women and the Colombian parties have been able to achieve. I will start by saying something about our efforts to support inclusive peace agreements, and they are both different in each context and surprisingly similar. They are contextual and different from one situation to the next because our work is impacted by factors such as the extent to which women already play key roles in public life and politics, whether there's a history of women's inclusion or not, the strength of civil society, who they are, whether they work on peace and security matters to begin with, whether they work together, whether they have political access, and if so, to whom, whether resistance to women's participation is a matter of expressed ideology, or whether the parties agree on women's participation or exclusion, or take different approaches. Also, we need to take a closer look at the women that we are engaging or not engaging, truly seeing them as political actors. So all of this means that we need a gendered conflict and actor analysis before we stake out the course. More and more such analysis are undertaken early on in the process. This is an expressed ambition in in our current National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, that we will do so. And we need to consider whether there's need for support of women's organizations' ongoing work to enhance their legitimacy or their visibility, whether we need to support their engagement in the process or help them build a coalition or all of the above. And we need to consider whether technical support is required for the women already involved in the process, or whether it's primarily a matter of providing access to key people or giving attention to the points they're making. So the context and therefore our entry points vary, but there are procedures to follow, and that's where the similarities come in as well. Because we strive for gender balance in our teams in all situations. We work to ensure that our teams understand what women's participation in peace processes is all about and how we practically go about it, which unfortunately is not evident. We expect from men as from women that they champion women's participation and rights, of course. And we engage the parties early on the importance of women's inclusion and ask them, questions that might alert them or make them think about the gendered aspects of the conflict and the peace that they want. We encourage each other to ask questions such as, who are we quoting now? Whose arguments are followed up in the conversation? Who's in the picture or showcased in the social media ads? And we have a women, peace, and security strategy for our processes and a women, peace, and security lead in each team. So as much as each situation is different, there are similarities, and we're also trying to learn from one process to the next, because there are recurring issues. As we aim to ensure that women participate at all levels and through all phases of peace processes, it's obvious to us that where the international community is struggling the most is to ensure women's influential participation in track 1. Therefore, this needs to be a main focus. A few examples of how we're trying to go about that in an imperfect world. Because often we find that delegations are filled up with men, so to speak. And so at times we might have to suggest that they add more representatives to the delegation in order for there to be enough space for women. We know something about how this has been done in practical terms before in a way that was acceptable to the parties. And so we build on that experience. Another example is when we find that the parties decide to convene on a very short notice and where there's need to, in an ad hoc way, bring also women to the table. This leads to practical and hectic turnarounds, not at all an ideal scenario, but it might be better to attempt to do something than to have no participation at all. And we now have experience to draw from to ensure that women are actually there in time, and that we can make the most of their presence by backstopping them and assisting them, asking what they need in order to be effective and providing that on a short notice. Focusing on track one is a matter of including the voices of the women as well as the men that represent conflict parties, but it's also about ensuring that the voices of the civilian population and the peace actors are heard in the decisive conversations. Oftentimes the latter ends up being about inclusion mechanisms. And while no perfect mechanism or model exists, we have learned from, let's say, the Syrian Women's Advisory Board and several African situation rooms, etc. It goes to a solution where women are underrepresented in consultations. This is very important, but we need to be asking where the uptake is. I would say that the main challenge and our main goal with regard to consultations as well as inclusion mechanisms is to ensure that there is uptake, that someone receives the input, the messages and recommendations coming out of the consultations and deliberations. That becomes the business of the conflict parties to deal with what they receive, such as you did succeed with to a large extent, I would say, in the Colombia process with the subcommission that was directly tied to the main table and where the parties themselves took part. Another recurring matter is the legitimacy of the inclusion mechanisms. We need to enable those that take part in this work to remain in steady contact with their constituencies so that they have the input and the backing that they required, so that the people they intend to speak on behalf of are able to feed in and understand and support the process. Also, we know that women are still perceived to be relevant or called in for women's issues primarily. Of course, it's our priority as Norway to engage women on all kinds of matters and in all kinds of positions as parties to the conflict, as experts, advisors, mediators, peace builders, witnesses, victims. The least we can do is to ensure that we consult women on all kinds of matters and engage women for technical assistance and in expert roles that are not solely gender related. Often women are expected to deliver on inclusion too, but until this becomes a matter of priority for men as well, we have not succeeded. Finally, civil society, the media and others might be watching carefully as we proceed. This is good for accountability, but we keep telling ourselves and each other that we need to ensure that we focus less on the public events than on the steady work under the radar that might in fact create a change for the people. The women need to know that they have our support, but we need to work with them and the parties in such a way that it benefits the long game, even if this kind of work is less visible to others. As for our preparations for the Security Council, we will bring in our experience from this peace and reconciliation work into our Women, Peace and Security work on the Council, and Women, Peace and Security will be a priority throughout. We'll focus on practical and concrete inputs to negotiations, contextual input to discussions. We plan to be the nerdy watchdog, as Women, Peace and Security will be a focus area as we work on mandates, resolutions, presidential statements, as we go through reports, take part in field visits. We'll strive to ensure that recommendations from the informal expert group on women, peace and security are taken into account in the Council's work, and invite women peace builders to brief the Council, encourage others to do so as well, despite the challenges posed by less physical presence in the UN at the moment. And we'll keep a keen eye on the security of women peace builders and human rights defenders in all our peace and security work. This includes keeping Security Council briefers safe before, during, and after their reporting to the Council. This might sound easy, but we know it's not. In each situation, there's at least 3 levels to consider. First, what is lacking in the mandate and the resolutions? What is needed more broadly? Secondly, what is the political space in this particular context on this particular matter? Thirdly, what is the priority, or what are the main priorities of the people living the conflict? And so we know that we have to have good intelligence. We know that we need to be able to do analysis quickly, choose our battles, and try to engage less likely partners. Also, we need to follow up on budgets, making sure that what has been decided in the Council is possible. through the resources and people required in missions. And we need to engage missions on country level, DPPA, DPO, civil society, to find out whether what has been decided is followed up on the ground. Because the challenge is both ensuring good mandates and good follow-up. In order to get there, we need to focus on some battles and do proper research so that we might choose the right ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marita, for that. And I particularly pick up on what you said on sort of what are the benefits for the long game. We know from research that gender equality can change positively at the end of war and in the beginning of peace, but that after 10 to 15 years, those sort of gains might be lost if it's not institutionalized. So if we're talking about creating impactful action, how do we also do that in a way that creates these long-term institutionalized changes? And I also really like both the sort of the national and the international perspective. So with that, I take us to the third presentation, sort of global lessons on research in this area. So Laura Wise, Research Associate at the Political Settlements Research Program at the University of Edinburgh, and Jan Popsicil, Research Director at the Austrian Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, Sleining, will talk about research on peace agreement negotiations and particularly on gender provisions. And this research has grown considerably over the last decade, and the PAX data has greatly contributed to that process, particularly on gender provisions. So they will present key trends and examples from this data and also give some insights into which kind of processes that are successful in including gender provisions. With that, I leave the floor to Jan and to Laura.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'll just start sharing my screen. Can you see that all right? Louise, can you just say if you can?
I can see it. It works really well. Yeah,
thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon. My name is Laura Wise. I'm a research associate with the Political Settlements Research Program at the University of Edinburgh. And today I'll be talking a little bit from our database about how the peace agreements produced by the handshake moments that you can see on your screen, how they actually refer to women and gender, whether or not they take a gender perspective, before Jan is going to share some insights on inclusion strategies and modalities behind some of these agreements using our new PeaceFem app. So I'll be drawing from version 4 of the PAX Peace Agreement database. It contains 1,868 peace agreements from 1990 until June 2020. And we've qualitatively coded the text of all these agreements, which enables us also to analyze how women, girls, and gender are referenced in these texts. As we know, UNSCR 1325, paragraph 8, calls on all actors involved when negotiating and implementing peace agreements to adopt a gender perspective. And it talks about what that might mean in practice. However, 20 years later, there's little evidence, apart from some more notable examples, of peace agreements really adequately addressing gender. We find that peace agreements seldom include a full gender perspective. Only 19% of peace agreements signed between 1990 and mid-2020 include at least some provisions that address women, their inclusion, and their rights. We find that many of these peace agreement references are single line and tokenistic at times, often referring to women as sort of one status equality group or sector to be included, but as a part of a long list of groups to be included in an agreement if referenced at all. Although we did hear earlier, and we will continue to hear about examples and agreements such as the final agreement in Colombia or the Sun City agreement from DRC that do take a more holistic gender perspective. So with the PAX gender database, we look at different overarching types of provisions for women and gender equality. So for example, whether they contain provisions for women's participation and equality, particular groups of women such as Indigenous women or refugees, international law, creating new institutions or reforming existing institutions, violence against women, transitional justice, development, and finally, women's role and consideration in the implementation of agreements. And research by our colleagues Christine Bell and Kevin McNichol at the University of Edinburgh shows that very few peace agreements include all of these types of provisions. And some of those that do take a more holistic approach have often struggled with implementing those provisions. And we'll hear probably more about that from colleagues in the second panel. The majority of provisions for women in peace agreements do relate to women's participation and equality, but some of these are merely providing for basic equality references, or they're short references to participation, but with little detail or mechanism for actually ensuring that participation in later stages. And often other important issues, such as creating new institutions for women or women's involvement in the implementation of the agreement, receive less attention in the texts. We find that the inclusion of women in peace agreement texts tends to be located in the more comprehensive or substantive agreements and stages of peace processes. So as you can see here, around 11% of ceasefire agreements contain references to women, girls, and gender, whereas 60% of what we classify as substantive or comprehensive agreements include gender references. If we look at this in a process, for example, in the Nepali peace process, none of the 12 ceasefire agreements from that process referred to women at all, while 11 out of the 19 substantive agreements, so about 58% of the substantive agreements from that process did contain references to women. Interestingly, if we look at the proportion of references, of agreements that contain references to women in peace agreements over time, we do see an uptick following the introduction of UNSCR 1325 in the year 2000. However, obviously I must stress this is not demonstrating any form of causation. So from 1990 to 2000, the average proportion of agreements that made reference to women, girls, or gender per year was 12%, whilst after the year 2000, that average proportion was 27%. However, you can also see that this is not a linear trajectory. And what also that Pax Gender doesn't show us is how women and women's inclusion advocates attempted to make these processes and agreements more gender inclusive, and whether or not those were actually implemented, which is one of the things that drove us to develop the PeaceFem mobile app, which we just launched earlier this year. And this combines our data from Pax Gender on 30 peace agreements across 19 peace processes with data from Inclusive Peace, and also data from the Monash Center for Gender, their implementation data. So what this does is makes sort of, rather than just having the snapshot of what exactly was provided from in the agreements, we can also see the strategies that were used to try and make the process or the agreement more inclusive, whether or not those provisions were implemented, but also what the enabling and constraining factors were around activism and efforts to promote gender inclusion within these processes. So I'm going to pass over to Jan now, who's going to talk a little bit more about what he's found when looking at this app. It's available from all the app stores, it's free to download, and talk a little bit more about these strategies and inclusion modalities.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Laura. As you see, and I think this is one of the real important things this app is able to show, that the agreements are you can approach the agreements and the gender provisions from different angles. So different strategies have been used for inclusiveness in these processes. These strategies are a bit like colluded from data we have found out, and from Inclusive Peace research, so research done by Tanya Paffenholz and colleagues. And if you look through these strategies, we have actually like 6 main ones and then several other options. I want to stick with just a few of them. Just like one quick back. I want to stick with just a few of them, which is those who are most regularly used, which is direct representation and consultations, by far in PEACE-FEM the most commonly found ones, and as we've seen then in the next slide, over the stages, also in implementation quite likely. And what has also been quite regularly used is inclusive commissions. So in this slide you see, and this is Tanja Pappenholz's work basically that I'm showing here, how direct representation has been used, and this is the most common thing in negotiations and then in implementations, and inclusive commissions as well as one of the things throughout the process. Just to highlight, and I want to highlight in some of the advantages and problems with these strategies. So inclusive commissions, and you see this is the interesting bit, that this is the one that really goes through. It is indeed, and this is one of the reasons why it is so strong in pre-negotiations, something which is also a segue for international support, and I would argue almost the most usual segue for international peacebuilding support. This is something which is supported in DDR processes, SSR processes, for instance. Having more inclusive commissions here, having gender representatives in several parts of the more technical level processes, and this is something which usually works quite well in the technical areas. The problem, of course, with many of these commissions is that they remain on the technical level, so their influence on the political substance of the talks is not necessarily a given. So this is a bit the trade-off you have to face here. The next element which is important are the elements of consultations. You see here in this slide 3 potential elements: official consultations, unofficial consultations, public consultations, with, especially in the implementation phase, the official consultations taking center stage. Well, with consultations, there's always a certain risk involved when it comes to gender inclusion. This is the big risk of compartmentalization. So you have, like, this is the prototypical picture that you face in some of the peace negotiations. There's this 10-15 minutes in the beginning where, like, the consultative parties, then there's the women groups coming in, raising the issues, then they move out, and then the serious talks start. This might sound as a bit of a cynical picture, but this is still something which is ongoing, and this is not just, this would be the high level, but this is a risk that drags down to various levels of the process. At the moment when these consultations, when women come in as women, it is also very easy to compartmentalize and sideline the issues that go along with that. The third element, and this is by far in negotiations the strongest factor, as we see in this graph, is direct representation. And direct representation is really the question which often comes down to quota of how many women are really sitting at the table of negotiations on the one hand, but also then in the different sets of power sharing institutions often that are then negotiated as an outcome of an agreement. Here is the big difference, I would interpret our data as well, and what type of negotiations we are really facing. It has been mentioned before that it's very important to have a look at the context. Marita described this, I guess, very well. And there is a huge difference if you have negotiations where there is a more genuine interest in really negotiating something which is resettling a whole polity, like you would see it in Colombia, or other agreements which are really difficult in terms of getting, like, even being negotiated. Like South Sudan would be another example. The revitalized agreement basically was just signed after immense pressure from neighboring countries on the main parties. So for them, it becomes then not so much an issue of how to reconfigure what is about to come, but more on, okay, what we're going to get out of this process that we don't like in the first place. And here, of course, the question of direct representation becomes an issue. It is still, like in the South Sudan case, one of the main methods used. And it's interesting if you look at how this has been negotiated. In fact, it did kind of a trick, because the woman quota and it is now 35% of the unified government, which is an outcome of the revitalized peace agreement, is actually nothing that has been then agreed in the negotiations, but is referring back to something which is already in the interim constitution, which was even before the civil war started. So it's kind of an older process, but became reinforced in the negotiation process. So there is, of course, the opportunity always to refer back to previous commitments that are there. Issue, of course, is these 35% are not reached in implementation, but this is then, of course, one of the big issues that we see. And I want to close with this thing. When we with this challenge, in a way, when we look at direct representation, there's always the question of context as a very big one. And as to kind of stress another example from the Sudanese context, the interesting thing in Sudan, so not South Sudan necessarily, but the Sudan like polity, even before the peace negotiations, was always that women played a kind of an important role there. But like, if you look at this in a closer kind of way, it's interesting why. It's not necessarily because of all these drives for inclusiveness, although they became part of the discourse. Their power came from their ability to play with their family ties as kind of interlocutors between two families that man could never reach. So in a way, a woman would represent in the political setup always kind of more power, more lever than a man, because she was able to refer to two families, not just to one family. So it's interesting that these kinds of broad issues in the background, which have long traditional roots, play quite a significant role when it comes down then to the numbers that are often negotiated when it comes to direct representation. So in a way, that the main point being here, it's important to look beyond the quota and beyond the percentage points that have been reached. It's often important to see also the context in what kind of way this is happening and what this is showing.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you, Laura. I think it's very important that you describe where I take with this sort of both the different types and the different forms and the different usages of gender provisions, and how this also plays into the larger political context, and how do we move from sort of towards integrating this in the actual decision-making processes, and how this can be resolved. And I think that also is a very good way into the final presentation, where the international mediator and the mediator mandate can play a significant role. So this is based on a recent paper by Catriona Stansfield, assistant professor at the Department of History and Political Science at Worcester State University, and Laurie Nathan, professor of the Practice of Mediation at the Mediation Program Director at the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies. So Catriona will here reflect on the central function of mediation mandate and the mediator agency, and sort of understanding also how then that can contribute to WPS being or not being, as the case might be, integrated into a peace negotiation and design process. So Catriona, the floor is all yours.
Lovely, thank you, Louise. So thank you very much for having us. Hello, everyone. I'm presenting on behalf of Laurie and myself. This is work in progress. Our research question focuses on how mediators' agency affects their implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So how do the choices that mediators make as they look at their mandates have substantive and procedural outcomes in terms of the inclusion of women and gender issues in negotiations? And lots of you will be familiar with the sort of state of the research and policy work on women, peace and security, because we've seen a lot of work on women's movements, women's agency in mediation processes, as well as modalities of inclusion, as the previous presentations pointed to. But there has been less focus so far on the role of the mediator in carrying out women, peace and security as part of their mandate. And while of course mediators are not free to do simply as they please, they do have some agency, and we think that it's an important part of understanding how the women, peace and security agenda gets implemented. And what we hope in this project is that it will be possible to generalize our thinking about mediator agency to other normative agendas as well. We argue that mediator agency, the space that they have to make decisions, is a function of 6 things. Firstly is the normative mandate. So in this case, the women, peace and security agenda, the resolutions, policies coming from the mediator's organization. The political mandate, again, how the organization behind the mediator places expectations on them in their role. The party mandate, so the consent of local parties for the mediator to be involved in talks, any previous agreements that may shape the format of talks and the role of the mediator. Domestic stakeholder pressure, so here domestic women civil society is often really important. External stakeholder pressure, for instance, donors and other third-party states that may have an interest in the conflict situation. And we also try to look at individual normative orientation of the mediator. So, does the mediator have some kind of long-standing commitment to this particular issue that may make them more likely to implement the women, peace and security agenda as they try to balance these mandates against one another? Because sometimes mandates may also be contradictory, and mediators have to choose how they go about interpreting and implementing them in their work. So I'm going to share with you the case of Yemen, specifically the case of JAMAL BENOMAR's time as Special Advisor of the Secretary General of the United Nations. We look at Yemen for 2 reasons. Firstly, it often gets mentioned in discussions of best practice in women's participation because of the quota system for women in the National Dialogue Conference, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. And it also offers us a chance to look at how different mediators in the same context or a reasonably similar context over time tackle this issue. So there are 3 mediators in the period that we look at in our study. So far, we have been drawing upon interviews with UN officials involved in the Yemen process as part of these teams, as well as documents from the UN and Yemeni civil society. And as the pandemic allows us, we will be also moving forward with more interviews with Yemeni women. And we also hope to extend this comparison across geographic cases. And we have discussed Syria and South Sudan as possible further cases for this project. So to give you a little sort of look at how we are thinking about how mediators make these decisions in the course of their work, we can look at JAMAL BENOMAR. So a little bit of context for Yemen. In 2011, as part of the Arab Spring uprisings, there were protests to remove President Ali Abdullah Saleh from power. He'd been in power for decades at that point. And basically things were escalating towards pretty serious conflict. And so the first round of negotiations really were under the auspices of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which helped to broker an elite bargain between the government and opposition parties that would see a peaceful transfer of power from Saleh to the vice president, and the formation of a government of national unity, and eventually the holding of new elections. So JAMAL BENOMAR was working within this framework. His early role was listening and reporting back on the GCC negotiations. But importantly, in 2011, he sort of helped facilitate negotiation of an implementation mechanism for the initiative. And this is important because we moved from this fairly short elite bargain to what basically constituted a roadmap for transition in Yemen. And it basically put in place provisions for a national dialogue conference that would help shape the future Yemen. And this was really important because it included language on inclusion. So when we think about the party mandate here, these documents, the GCC initiative and the implementation mechanism, help set the groundwork for what the political process would look like and what the role of BENOMAR would be within that. But we also saw that he had some influence over how the party mandate ended up looking, and particularly these hooks of language on inclusion proved to be key later on. The political mandate, again, BENOMAR being a representative of the Secretary General, his brief initially came from the Secretary General. BENOMAR actually played a role in defining his mandate. He actually asked for a listening brief early on, but this moved over time to a more active facilitation and mediation role, especially in regard to the implementation mechanism. And then we saw the Security Council affirm these agreements in its own resolutions, and then also make references to the importance of ensuring women's participation in any transitional arrangements. So the political mandate here is that from the Secretary General initially, and then from the Security Council, again, we're seeing some language on inclusion. One thing we found throughout the course of our research is that there's often a narrative that BENOMAR was the one to put forward this idea of a quota for women's inclusion. And what we found was that Yemeni women's civil society had been active on this issue since at least 2003. They had pressured Saleh on a question of a quota for women's participation in elected and appointed positions. Women were then, of course, active in the protests, and they pressured BENOMAR early on the inclusion of women in the transitional arrangements, particularly through a quota mechanism. So, and then the last point that I want to sort of bring out from our framework is that of individual normative orientation. We see mixed evidence on this. We know that BENOMAR made a lot of public statements about the importance of women's representation throughout the National Dialogue Conference and in the run-up to it. We see some mixed evidence in terms of people's perception of his genuineness of commitment, and I think that is hard for us to adjudicate as researchers. But what we do see is earlier in his career, we see a lot of writing from him, a lot of statements from him on the importance of inclusive national dialogues. So we can see that there is some genuine disposition toward inclusion and linking inclusion, seeing inclusion as something that is both viable and valid in the context of mediation rather than a barrier, for instance. There are two sets of important outcomes, particularly as regarding the National Dialogue Conference. So we know that BENOMAR was able to advocate for women's inclusion in the transitional arrangements. So this came in the form of women's representation in the Technical Preparatory Committee for the NDC. And this was really important because this body actually helped set the rules and procedures and working format of the NDC. This body also put forward the quota formula of the 50-30-20 approach. So 50% Southern Yemenis, 30% women, and 20% youth. And this was carried through to the conference. And it was a really important and interesting mechanism because rather than having women concentrated in one body or in consultations, women were spread across all working groups. And the way that the quota worked meant that if you refused to fill your share of women in your delegation, you would miss out on a seat in a working group. And so it was strategically important for delegations to respect the quota so that they could actually be effective in the National Dialogue Conference. And substantively, we saw that although the women who were represented in the NDC were very, very diverse, obviously, with a lot of different perspectives on what the future of Yemen should look like. And so we didn't see women necessarily acting as a bloc or, a women's grouping, but we did see across working groups that Yemeni women in the NDC were often quite effective in putting forward recommendations on issues that are generally of particular interest to women. So again, this quota appeared again in several working groups, that there should be a quota in the constitution for women's representation in elected and appointed positions at all levels of a federal Yemen, equal citizenship on the basis of sex, reform to family law, and other issues. And the NDC recommendations were important because they're the basis for Yemen's future constitution. And that is still the case despite the subsequent collapse of the process. So just to sum up quickly, mediator agency is of course constrained. Mediators have to work often within competing mandates from different bodies, local parties, domestic and external stakeholders, but they do have some scope to make choices in how they implement the women, peace and security agenda. And we think that those choices deserve more attention. One thing we found is that the interplay between mediators and domestic women's groups is really, really important. Again, in this case, we see that BENOMAR is really able to pick up on a recommendation that Yemeni women have been working with for a long time. This is the quota, and that it was substantively and procedurally quite impactful when it came to the NDC. We also saw that BENOMAR was able to include or push for the inclusion of language on women, peace and security across the different mandates, the political and the party mandates in particular. And this made it likely that then he could advocate more effectively for the inclusion of women and gender issues because those hooks were already there. The structure of talks does matter. We know that national dialogues inherently offer some more procedural openings for direct inclusion of women and gender issues. And we see this as if we compare to later stages of talks in Yemen, where it's shuttle diplomacy or a much more exclusive elite negotiation process, that there have been challenges there. And lastly, some individual mediators seem to have some more agency than others in defining their roles. And this was the case with BENOMAR, who came to Yemen initially with a lot of credibility as an Arab human rights activist who had been jailed for his beliefs and his work. And so he had quite a lot of credibility, not just with the parties, but with young people who were in the protest movement. And so we're looking forward to hearing your questions or comments on this research. And we'll take those into account as we move forward with this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catriona. I think you touch on a lot of very important points. Two things that I take with me in particular, I think is both the question of sort of professional roles and sort of what lies within the span of particular professional roles for also promoting WPS. So if we're actually going to move this up to the actual decision-making functions, who is then responsible for what in that? And I think also another really important point you touch on is the fact that we're starting to move in the direction where each process doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. Of course, each is a very context-specific situation, but there are a number of tools available that you can sort of think if they are appropriate and you can adapt them to that particular process. And I think that speaks, to me at least, to the organizational processes involved in also realizing WPS in a more systematic manner. And I think not least, of course, like you and all other presenters, that women are not one coherent political group. They represent a lot of different political interests. So how do we take that women's agency seriously into consideration? So with that, I'm going to move to the Q&A session. I encourage you all to submit questions to the panelists. If you haven't done so already, I have received some great questions. So I think I'm going to start probably from with you, Kat, and with Laurie, sort of work my way back up again in the panel. There is some talk about sort of, if you into speaking on the professional role of the mediator, if you were to incorporate or like have a criteria or competence on gender equality or WPS for being appointed a mediator, what do you see are the benefits and the problems with those kinds of discussions, and did you come across them in your research? And another that I received from the audience concerned an argument that we often hear, sort of is there a discussion among mediators and in your research that you've seen also on, do they see trade-offs in terms of including women? Do they see sort of the bigger power game and women's inclusion as being in contradiction or in support of each other? I think I'm going to let you start, and also please feel free to also reflect on the other panelists' discussions.
Maybe, Laurie, if I can maybe take the first question, you can take the second. How does that sound? Great. So in regard to the UN, and this is from other research I've done, and Laurie can also reflect on this, there are, you know, generic terms of reference now for senior special envoys, special representatives of the Secretary General, and those terms of reference do include language on competence in gender equality and women, peace and security. And that has changed over time as the processes for selection and appointment have become a little more standardized, although my sense is that there is still a lot of informality in the process, even as we see moves to try to make it more professional, right? I think where a lot of advocates would probably have questions is how much do those requirements really get weighted in the decision process? That's not something I have an answer to, but if you look at these terms of reference, they kind of, language on gender sort of appears a little farther down, and we see a lot more about the importance of a special envoy's political judgment, for instance, at the start. And so my sense is, I don't know yet like how much, you know, individual mediators are being assessed, for instance, by the UN on their competence in this area, or if when it comes time for reappointment, if this is something that is really figuring into the decision-making process, or if there are other factors at play. I think we need more information about that, but that's a kind of tricky area to get more information on. But Laurie probably has some reflections on this as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you to the presenters. On the selection of mediators, I think there's a distinction that we can draw between the UN, regional bodies, and states that appoint mediators. And they use different criteria. So for some countries, Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, the question of the mediator's gender commitment may be very important. Whereas in my country, South Africa, that wasn't the case. With the UN, it's not at all clear, despite close observation, whether there are any sound and consistent criteria at all that are used when the Secretary General appoints a special envoy, let alone gender criteria. You know, is there a sound political fit? Is there a sound cultural fit? Often the UN appoints really great mediators in the sense of the right person for the job, and others, it appears not the case. So my sense is gender is not taken into account as part of a broader problem of not thinking seriously enough about who's the right mediator for this job. In terms of the trade-offs, you know, one of the things we're trying to communicate through this project is a kind of corrective to both the policy community and the scholarly literature's preoccupation with the mediator at the expense of being preoccupied with the parties. Because at the end of the day, it's the parties that decide. Do we continue fighting? Do we not continue fighting? Do we have a peace process or not? Do we have a mediated outcome solution or not? And what the content is. So the mediator may have some influence and external actors may have some influence, but at the end of the day, you, the mediator, can't run ahead of the parties. At the end of the day, if they're not committed to their agreement, there is no agreement. So this is not, this question of ownership is not only normative, it's a pragmatic consideration. So the mediator is, in that sense, constrained. It's the parties' agreement, not the mediator's agreement. But as Katrina pointed out, mediators have some discretion and some latitude, some agency. And that the exercise of that will depend on context. So they may be less concerned about inclusion during a ceasefire negotiation than a national dialogue. As Katrina said, it will depend on their personal normative commitment to gender. And it will depend on how much the parties are willing to entertain this. And I think a really important point for those of us that consider ourselves to be gender advocates, can we support domestic women's groups advance their agenda? Because that push on the parties can, in some instances, as in Yemen, be very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I have a question also, or two actually, for Jan and Laura. On one is in terms of the different kinds of measures you pointed out, Jan, in terms of different kinds of gender provisions on ensuring participation. Can you say something about sort of who decides on which women get selected into or being sort of representative of women within these mechanisms? And another question that we have received is also, because I know that your PACS gender data set also contains sort of different forms of agreements in different phases. So we have a question on, do formulations of gender provisions, do they change over time? And also, are there revisions of gender provisions and gender sort of peace agreements further down in the implementation process? That how do these also cater to gender provisions? Do they get stronger? Do they get weaker? What happens sort of over time with gender provisions in peace agreements?
Shall I start with the first question? It's actually not such an easy question, because I have to say we don't have really hard data on how this really works. So I can speak to this from experiences I've made in several processes. Like especially like I've worked over the last 2-3 years more on South Sudan, so I've seen how this happened there. And I mean, in a certain kind of sense, it's always, I mean, to put it more generally, I think what WPS has accomplished is that in countries where peace processes are running, there is a professionalization in women's movements. And this is of course upsides and downsides and problems, of course, but this is definitely something I guess we can see. And those who get the seats at the table are usually those who kind of can command the connections necessary to make their way in. I have to say, I was last year in Helsinki. There was a conference by the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs on national dialogues, which was kind of interesting because they took a lot of interest in inclusion and women's participation there. And you could see by the women who actually been there as participants in the processes, those were of course those who were very well connected. Though I have to say, this also goes further down. So in South Sudan, you'll see that this general demand for especially gender inclusion has triggered down to also like local governance levels, where there's women's groups basically really going down to the community level, because it's actually something that is kind of almost expected, not just by the donors then anymore, but also like by all kinds of political structures. There is of course still the big issue of how making these women, these groups heard in the big process. I think Colombia has done or has shown how this could work, but we have to take into account that actually in terms of what we see in peace negotiations and peace processes, Colombia is more the outlier than the regular case. It's kind of, you could argue, okay, this is kind of a long-standing democracy in a kind of a very, very kind of good economic setting, where you could use of internet participation or whatever. In South Sudan and most of the regions, you couldn't rely on internet at all because it's just not existing. So it's a very difficult way also in terms of language. People wouldn't speak the same language, simply wouldn't understand. So there's very, very many obstacles to get the kind of the voices really in. They tried to do this as well over a national dialogue, but like I would argue, as in Yemen, the national dialogue processes usually work very well, also in terms of inclusiveness, by the way, as long as they're on a local level. And at some point, when it comes to the national level, there is the point where politics really set in and becomes an issue. It's, for example, it's kind of funny, the national dialogue at the local level in South Sudan was more like what came out from the local consultations, that people would actually accept the 50% quota for women's participation. People would be fine with that. Donors then were about to kick it back to more like the 35%, which is then what was then agreed. And even, of course, on a political level, it's not even holding. Pass over to Laura for the other question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
So yeah, Louise, as you said that we classify agreements by particular stages. That enables us definitely, if we then also code and categorize for issue, then we can definitely see whether or not a particular provision is adopted throughout a process, whether that changes in terms of the substance, the details. So for example, hypothetically, if you had a provision for women's participation via a quota, if that changed from say 60 to 25%, or if you have a provision for a quota at one stage in the process and then you lose that quota completely. I think what we do see is it definitely depends on the stage of the agreement, the extent to which there are likely to be provisions related to gender in that, as I explained in the presentation. But what's interesting about that is, firstly, we still don't look enough at those earlier stages, and particularly pre-negotiations, although Conciliation Resources have just published a fantastic report that looks much more into those earlier processes to ask questions about inclusion. But for a long time, I think we have very much focused on looking at gender inclusion in terms of provisions on comprehensive peace agreements, and also at national level agreements rather than more local peace agreements, which is something we're also looking at, whether or not you see a similar distinction in percentage in terms of stages. Something to bear in mind is that we know that peace processes aren't linear in terms of their trajectory. So if, say, we're only having 11, if you're less likely to get a provision for women's inclusion or a gender provision in a ceasefire agreement, what does that mean if you have 15 ceasefires throughout that process and you're sort of going back and forth between implementation and ceasefires without necessarily reaching that comprehensive agreement? Does that open opportunities if you've got earlier commitments in an agreement for a gender provision or particular level of detail, or a mechanism that maybe might be easier to hold people accountable to or committed to? Does that give you that space to say, okay, well, we previously had a slight reference or a sort of more rhetorical or weaker reference to gender in an earlier agreement in a process? Can we go back to that if we're going back in a stage? And that's something that I think we're still trying to figure out using that stage and those trajectories of processes impacts. But also what's been interesting for me being involved with supporting women involved in the process in Yemen is that sort of, once you do have a sort of more substantive commitment to women's inclusion, so that quota, that's something that people really hold on to. Whether or not parties are holding on to that, as Jan says, is a very different question. But what we're very much interested in is, like, at PSRP, is once you have these hooks, can you use them later? And we do see examples of that with other provisions as well, particular references to parties having previously committed to uphold international humanitarian law, for example. We see people then trying to go back to that later on in a conflict without having to kind of reopen and renegotiate that. But whilst we can sort of use the agreements to track this, we know from these presentations and other research that what's going on behind the scenes is a lot more messy. So I think I'll stop there, but that's a great question.
Good, yeah, thank you. And thank you for a really great answer. I have questions now for Juanita and Marita. I'm going to sort of combine them. I'll start with you, Juanita, in terms of we've had a question about the Gender Commission. Does it have a role also after the signing of the agreement, and also the follow-up mechanisms that were instituted by the agreement? And then there's a joint question between you, Juanita, and Marita, in terms of, so we talk about women sort of representing many different political interests. So there are situations where women come in quite divided, or the women's movements perhaps is quite divided going into a peace process. And we also must respect that women do not represent one coherent political interest. At the same time, it's also a need to try to support women's inclusion. So how do we have sort of lessons learned on how to deal with that kind of context when sort of women are more politically also divided in the conflict? And finally, Marita, one question to you in terms of the argument that Laurie also addressed. Sort of, have you come across the question of sort of is there a trade-off in dealing with women, peace and security, and sort of moving towards peace, and how have you dealt with that argument? Juanita, I'm going to let you start.
Thank you. Well, great questions. On if the Gender Subcommission had a role in the implementation, well, not exactly as like a following Gender Subcommission for the implementation, but it did on when we had the referendum, people said no, and we had to renegotiate the agreement. That gave us an opportunity to include things that we had kind of forgotten in the first draft. So there were several things that were included as a gender body from the government side to oversee within the state the implementation of the agreement. That was one. And then several other instances were created in a similar format as the Gender Subcommission, meaning government and FARC and the UN in some cases. To oversee the implementation of the peace agreement. What it did happen is that most of us from the government and FARC, our next role in the implementation was, in my case, in the monitoring and verification mechanism of the ceasefire. So a couple of us from the Gender Subcommission went to that commission, and others at the CCV, which is the instance in which all the implementation is, you know, if we have things between the government and FARC that had to be agreed or concrete measures, then they are the ones who deal with that. So to conclude this question, the format was translated into different instances for the implementation. And some of us end up in those instances, but not a gender committee to supervise the implementation, but similar. Okay. And then the second question, well, I think I mean, women, there are several shades of women, and I guess diversity is better in these cases, in these scenarios, because you're dealing with a very complex situation, and having a unified movement of women is almost impossible. What it happens here is that, and I'm sure Rosamilia in the next panel will touch on that, but they find a way to, despite all the differences and approaches, to gather women from very opposite sides and beliefs to try to join in a common goal to help the peace talks. That was one. And in our case, for us, government and FARC was great to receive such a diverse proposals or demands and claims. So it was great to have, I don't know, 700 proposals for the ceasefire, or 1,000 different proposals. So we were lucky to have such a diverse and rich proposals from very different point of view. But we did manage, and even from my colleagues from FARC, of course, we were enemies at the peace talks. So despite all of our deep differences, especially me, because I was in the military forces at that time, we found a way to work together to try to find a common goal, which was that women in Colombia, despite our background, we were suffering very deeply from the conflict and of course also from patriarchy. So we needed to fix that. And that was one common thing that we find. So we knew that we disagree in many, many things, but we agree on that we had to make sure that the text of the agreement was going to be good for women in Colombia despite all the difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Juanita. Marita, I'm now hoping we can see you.
Yes, you can see me,
Oh,
although a
wonderful,
bit
wonderful.
vague, I think. Yes, good. Well, very interesting discussions and good questions. Well, on the first question on women's differences and different opinions and how to deal with that, I think, speaking as a, an actor who is often in a facilitator role, I think our approach is, to work on both sides of this issue. So on the one hand, it is our role to advise the women's movement that it might make sense for them to come together and to have a unified stance on some issues, as we found that the women in Colombia were able to do, despite their very many differences. So, I mean, there might be need, for instance, or if that's expressed by the civil society that they would like to build a coalition, or they're willing to discuss that, that's something that we will often support, because we see, for us, it's helpful to have someone to engage that isn't, only representing this one organization or this one group. And for them, it is easier to gain some traction for their viewpoints if they are many and together. So that's the one part of it, to be to be available to advise and to provide technical assistance and financial support, political support in order for women to come together and to see if they can establish a common agenda on certain points. The other side of this is to work with the parties and with all the people that we work with to convey the differences as a strength, because the whole idea of inclusive peace process is to hear different voices. And so we often make the case that it is, that's when you see that the women are relevant. It's when they are who they are, representing the groups that they represent, the different ethnicities, gender identities, religions, whatever the diversity might be, differently abled women, and to have them speak from their points of view and have their grievances heard and have their solutions heard and have that crazy magnitude of opinions and issues and to try to deal with that. I mean, that's the whole idea of the inclusive peace process, is to ensure that we don't miss part of the picture. And so I find that while we want to advise the women to get together, to have the strength in numbers, we also need to work with all the others who claim that it's a problem that the women are politicized, for instance. Of course women are, just as men are. And we need to see that as a strength. So if the women coming from different political angles and different groups are able to sit together, that often is more than the men in the same camps are able to do. And if they're even able to agree on a few, common points, that's amazing. And to use that then as a strength and to see how they can then contribute also to build the momentum for the process that is ongoing. So I think it is wise for women to get together. We'll support on that, but we'll also make the case for diversity being a good thing, and to see how we can enable that diversity to show through also within the women's groups. And for that reason, we also often support different women groups, their individual work, as well as the building of coalitions. On the other parts, on trade-offs, I think that completely depends on the process. In some processes, women's rights might be politicized, women's participation might be very politicized. On those occasions, yes, it might be, it might be part of the political capital that you employ or choose not to employ if you highlight women's rights and women's participation very strongly. But I think we have no choice, given, as Norway, we have a policy, UN has a policy, regional organizations do so, many countries do so. So despite that, it will perhaps cost some political capital in some processes, I think we have a clear order to go in that direction. But yes, some political capital. In other processes, we'll say, you know, this might be one of the easy wins. It might be some of the low-hanging fruits where it is easier to get the parties to unite and to agree on issues. And for instance, it might be very much easier to agree on women's inclusion than on transitional justice or other matters that might be much more political and much more delicate. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And with that great remarks and with all of your great responses, we are unfortunately running out of time. So I want to thank the audience for sending in such fantastic, difficult, but really good questions, and a very, very warm thank you also to our fantastic audience, Juanita, Marita, Jan, Catriona, Laura, and Lori, for your presentations and for sharing your knowledge with us today. It was just as interesting, thought-provoking, and substantive as I was hoping. So I'm really, really glad you can all join us today. So with that, I leave the word to Josefina, and we will now prepare for the second panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everyone, for your excellent presentations. And thank you also to the audience for the questions you sent in advance and these new questions that just came in our Q&A. We're now starting our second panel of the webinar, and we're turning our gaze towards the phase of implementation of the peace accords. Research and practice have shown that, contrary to common belief, the phase of implementation is far from being a purely technical endeavor of putting into practice what has been agreed upon on the negotiation table. Implementation is a process that also requires adjustments, negotiations, and above all, conflict transformation mechanisms that allow peace accords to act as sustainable platforms for nonviolent change and structural reforms. I'm very glad to have in this panel an excellent and diverse group of individuals speaking about topics that are key for grasping the WPS agenda and implementation. And we will start the panel with Madhav Yoshi. Let me see, Madhav, if you have your camera turned on, if you can maybe help me turn it on. Yeah, thank you. Madhav will present on lessons from research about peace agreement implementation, challenges and opportunities. He is a research associate professor and associate director of the Peace Accords Matrix. I'm very glad to call him my colleague. Madhav will open the panel with an introductory presentation offering perspectives of main research findings derived from investigating implementation, and will share with us some key results on factors affecting implementation of peace agreements. Thank you. Madhav, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Josefina. It's a really stimulating discussion here this morning, my side of the world. I'll start, just by saying that the entire peace implementation process is full of opportunities and challenges, full of complexities in terms of process, actors, issues, and outcomes. My plan today is that I am going to focus on opportunities and challenges as a researcher of peace agreement design and implementation, and also as someone who had the opportunity to closely work with peace process stakeholders, peace building practitioners, and civil society actors. I hope by the end of my presentation, I would be able to show you that the research that we do in Peace Accords Matrix is innovative and comprehensive. In Peace Accords Matrix, we examine implementation of 51 different provisions, including women's rights, negotiated in comprehensive peace agreement. And we cover all comprehensive peace agreements negotiated since 1989. Those of you who are closely monitoring the peace process research, can have few simple questions when I say we examine implementation of all comprehensive peace agreements since 1989, 51 different provisions. You can have a simple questions like, why 51 provision? Why comprehensive peace agreements? Why agreements since 1989? And why even bother about implementation? Before Peace Accords Matrix program, the peace process research mostly focused on two aspects. First, whether the mode of conflict termination, whether it is a rebel victory, government victory, or peace agreement, relate to sustainable peace. And a common finding, out of that research is that over peace over 50% of negotiated settlements, they tend to fail. And we still subscribe to this narrative, to this finding. But if you look the comprehensive peace agreements, only the cluster of comprehensive peace agreements, the failure rate is about only 15%, not 50%. The second, thing from the earlier research is that a key power sharing provisions such as government power sharing, economic power sharing, military power sharing, and territorial power sharing contribute to durable peace. And the conclusion out of that research is that the more power sharing is the better for sustainable peace. These earlier studies used data between 1946 and early 1990s. During the Cold War years, peace agreement negotiation was not the norm. There were not a lot of mediators involved in facilitating the peace process. The period covered in earlier analysis did not have many peace agreement terminations, and those with ones were not comprehensive enough, and therefore they tend not to be stable. Let me give you a couple of slides here. On this one, I think I have to share my screen here. Can you see all right here?
Yes.
Very
Perfect.
good. I think I have to do presentation, if I remember this correctly. Oops. Yeah. So as you can see in this graph, this data, the graph is generated using the data from Uppsala Conflict Data Program and the United Nations Peacemaker list of peace agreements. And it looks, only the peace agreements that were negotiated in context of intra-state armed conflict. As you can see here, between the Cold War period, you don't have a lot of peace agreements negotiated then. And once there is the end of the Cold War, then you can see sudden increase in the frequency of peace peace agreements negotiation there. And the early peace agreement, in the early phase of after the end of the Cold War, you see uptick of the negotiation of peace agreement. And it relates to the context like in Lebanon or in El Salvador or in Nicaragua. And in the post-Cold War period, the rise and fall of armed conflict, I would say, is proportionately related to the efforts of making peace, with the rise and fall of the peace agreement negotiations. And as you can see, since 2010, there is an uptick in the number of armed conflict as the number of peace agreement goes down, that I mark here with red circle. The point that I am trying to make here is that the peace agreement is much more frequent, but in the last 5 years, or 10 years, I would say it has gone down. So what does that mean in terms of our research? In terms of our research, we were able to empirically examine and test the hypothesis that the earlier peace accords tend to fail than the peace accords that were negotiated later in the late phase of the peace process. And it is precisely because the late phase of the peace process, they tend to negotiate the comprehensive peace agreement. And comprehensive peace agreements, they tend to include more provision. We found that, and we reported in our publication that the durability of negotiated peace agreement does not depend on a set of provisions like power sharing or DDR, but the sum of various reforms that were negotiated in those agreements. You cannot imagine, the armed actors negotiating only power sharing deal or only amnesty deal. They tend to deal with a lot of reform issues, and these issues are many of, some of those reforms. So far, I hope, I were able to give you the view that why since 1989, why comprehensive peace agreement, and things like that. Now I'm moving to the frequency here. So as you can see in the first graph, oops. Did you see the second slide here?
We can see it, but only very small, Maha.
Yeah, okay, sorry. There should be two figures here. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that, in the earlier peace accords, you don't see a lot. I mean, first point that I would like to make here is that not a lot of peace accords contain provision. Provision means the substantial reforms, that you are negotiating. The blue line here is and blue bar here is without provision, and then the purple bar here is with at least one provision. So we have to understand that not all the peace accords contain provision, only some of them or many of them contain provision. And the second graph that I am trying to demonstrate here is that the comprehensive peace agreements tend to include a lot of provisions, and over time the frequency of provisions negotiated in comprehensive peace accord are is increasing. They are negotiating more and more provision here. So the findings from our empirical research is that it is not only the subset of reforms that is contributing to durable peace, but it is the sum of the reforms that are negotiated in those accords that lead to durable peace. So now I'm moving to the implementation research here. And before the peace accords matrix, there were literally a couple of peace accords that were focusing on implementation, and it's a cross-sectional studies that use the implementation of power sharing provisions, only power sharing provisions. So we see this as an opportunity for us to expand to all 51 provisions that we identify in comprehensive peace agreement, and to do it, do the implementation data for up to 10 years. So our challenge, when we were collecting systematically the data on implementation was because it takes a lot of efforts and dedication to match the exact text of the peace accord and find the implementation related activities. Our another challenge when we were doing this the implementation research is that there is a lot of disagreement among scholars and also to some extent those who have interest in peace implementation on weight of provisions. Like, for many of us, the certain provision in the peace agreement weight more than the others, right? And in peace accords matrix, we treat all provisions and their implementation equally. And the reason we do this is that, in our interaction with the practitioners, we realized from the very beginning that the parties have walked out of negotiation on disagreement on a simple phrase or even a word on peace agreement. So as a research project, we are better off to treat all provisions equally and let the others decide how much weight they want to put on those provisions and implementation. So collecting implementation data systematically with annualized view is a challenge. You really have to exhaust all available resources, but at the same time it is opportunity for the researchers to immerse themselves as a researcher on a contentious implementation process and navigate through the indicators of implementation. We, as we collect more implementation data, then we started to see the significant role of international actors, national actors, civil society actors on the ground playing important role, and the issue of ownership. and most importantly, the significance of process itself. When you have a process in place, it leads to very interesting outcome. So by focusing on implementation of all provisions, we are now able to know the implementation. I'm talking about the research, out of the implementation data that we have here. To know the sequence of implementation of certain provisions can be enabling or disabling in terms of implementation success going forward. We found that the internal safeguard mechanisms that are negotiated in peace agreement itself, like the power sharing mechanisms, like the dispute resolution mechanisms, and most importantly, the verification mechanisms, contribute significantly to overall implementation success. With annual data, we are able to examine the overall implementation trajectories that you can see in this graph here. This graph gives you the 10-year implementation overview. In first year, average implementation for all 34 comprehensive peace agreements that we have in our data is only 39%. And if you, at the year of, the 10th year mark, you have an implementation rate of only 76%. So that means, not all peace accords are implemented in full. Implementation process drags for many, many years. And, sometimes the implementation can be framed as a contentious negotiation process, or the, the extension of the negotiation process itself.
Yeah.
Here. Focus on implementation, with focus on implementation, then we are able to use the data to understand, the impact of implementation on broader socio-political and economic reforms. We were able to use the data on the behavior of other armed groups who are not part of the peace process, and also the economic growth, the issue of the foreign direct investment in countries coming out of civil war. I would say,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think we're not seeing the correct slide. We just got, I think we're still on the very first one.
Oh.
But if I may interrupt you, because the time is up, so that we have enough time for the other presenters, maybe you can just finish with one last sentence and we come back to you in the Q&A. Is that okay?
That's okay. So, yeah, sorry, I don't know why the slides are not moving. Let me. That's okay, so I can maybe it's gonna work later on. So the important thing here is that the implementation research is perhaps the single most important contribution of the peace accords metrics for the research community and for the practice community. It has a lot of practical relevance for researchers and practitioners. Because this panel is also about gender provision and the design and implementation of peace agreement on WPS agenda, let me quickly refer to what we found in terms of comprehensive peace agreements in terms of gender, women's political rights issue. There are only 7 instances of women's political rights negotiated in these comprehensive peace agreements. Out of 34 comprehensive peace agreements, there were only 5 peace agreements with women's signatories. And then only out of 5, only 3 of them have the women's political rights negotiated in that one.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to conclude here, and then for the sake of time, and we can come back later on other issues. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Madhav. And I'm very glad to now give the word to our co-convener to Louise Olson, who is a senior researcher at PRIO. She's going to share with us insights on measuring gender provision implementation on a global level by presenting examples from the implemented gender provision dataset, IGP. So Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Josefina, and thank you, Madhav. I'm really going to build on your, let's see if I manage to, your presentation. Oh, now the PowerPoint is also with me, thankfully. Because I think, like Jan and Laura also captured very well in the former panel, to think of the design of and implement sort of the connection between the design and implementation of gender provisions, and also what the broader implementation processes look like, and what kind of influence that has on the realization of the gender provisions. So sort of two core aspects. So what I will do is draw out some questions and issues that have come up as we have been working on this data set, that, you know, being very humbly aware of the fantastic other panelists and the audience, to really get your feedback on some of the core questions that we have been thinking about. And I will do this looking more at the systematic sort of global level, and then I know that Rebecca and Rosa is going to provide some really great insights into what this looked like in practice on the in Colombia. So we know from research by Anderson and by Bell, for example, that the parties to war have been increasingly sort of pressured to take women's rights and women's organizations' demands for inclusion of gender equality in peace agreements into account increasingly over time. And we also know, as was shown in the former panel, that 1325 appears to have played a role in that. And in this process, one of the more sort of common tools to try to explicitly include women's rights and security in situation is to include gender provisions. However, what we also see is in several surveys done during implementation processes is that there seem to be that there's a gap between women and men's attitudes in terms of how sort of happy they are with the implementation, or how content they are, where men tend to be more content than the women. So it might be that sort of the commitments or the signaling made by the parties or the state to the women that their concerns are to be taken into consideration isn't really realized in the peace implementation phase. The UN Secretary General's report on women, peace and security in 2019 also highlight that there might appear to be some specific problems in relation to realizing the gender provisions. And so in this data set, what we are interested in is then trying to sort of see if what is then going on with this implementation more closely. And so what we do is that we base our work on the Uppsala conflict data program that we see here in the graph. They have coded 355 agreements, I think, back to 1975. And so that's the darker green line, and then the lower lighter line is the proportion of agreements that have including gender provision. So we sort of start from that realization. So what we're looking at or want to bring up in this particular instance is sort of the questions regarding the design aspect of these provisions and what those can entail for whether or not they are implemented. That of course doesn't mean that we in any way mean that those are the only factors affecting implementation. Political willingness, capacity, etc. are absolutely key factors, but we are interested in looking more specifically at the provisions themselves. And because we think that, as Mara was also outlined, is implementation processes are to a large extent bureaucratic, political, large-scale reform processes, at least many of them. The ability to translate the words into action is sort of what we're focusing on in this presentation. So in a sense, to as more eloquently put by the UN Secretary General, to sort of move from rhetorics to impactful action. So just like the fantastic PAX gender dataset, we also start from the fact that peace agreements can contain many different kinds of gender provisions. So there's no such thing as sort of one form of gender provision. And we also think that this is important, as was highlighted in earlier discussions, in that also means that the gender provisions are actually used to address a range of different kinds of gender equality problems or issues that exist in a particular context. So, for example, there are some of these provisions that address quite concrete problems. So the reintegration of female combatants, land reform or legal reform. Others are broader. They try to create sort of a legal or normative transformation of society. Or a third form can seek to sort of create a platform for women to affect the actual implementation process without actually specifying which particular issues that women are to sort of where gender equality is to change. And this also means that we can expect sort of different types of gender provisions can meet different challenges during the implementation phase. So for example, if gender provisions fall into the category that is prioritized by the former warring parties related to security, for example, maybe those provisions will have an higher likelihood of implementation rather than perhaps those that fall under sort of broader social change that might not be as prioritized, at least not in the earlier phases. So we really think that there's a important lesson sort of in connection here needed between research on implementation, just as described by Madhav, and sort of then adding the gender hierarchies and understanding the gender dynamics that might also then affect gender provisions specifically. Another key aspect when thinking around why we have some challenges or why we have particular challenges regarding gender provisions can also be related in terms of how the agreement is composed and formulated. Just like Mara was saying, there are particular aspects regarding magnitude, for example, of different types of provisions that it can sort of exist within the same agreement. So if we look at agreements between 1975 and 2017, it's apparent that there can be sort of substantive variation even within, as I said, one agreement where, as an abstract example, you could say that maybe there are 15 gender provisions on rural reform, there may be 12 on political participation, and then there might be 3 or 4 on security. So this is in a way expected because that's normal for sort of how peace agreements are composed also overall in terms of the non-gender provisions. But I think in terms of understanding the implementation of gender provision, it's still important to ask if can we assume that the magnitude of gender provisions within one type, so if there are 15 on land reform, is that so that we should then assume that that means that that was the area where women's organizations had made the largest demands, that this is an area where it's most critical for gender equality developments? Or is it so also that this was an area where it was easier to get gender provisions approved in the main agreement? So does it also say something about the priority and sort of the political standpoints of the parties? Because that can of course then be important in terms of how you support implementation. Another dimension to magnitude is of course that the larger the processes and the more the gender provisions, the more support and capacity building might be needed if it's so that it's in an area that the state has sort of struggled with in terms of capacity prior to adopting the agreement. So also thinking around resource distributions. In addition to that, it seems to be differences in quality of the provisions and how they are formulated. And if we are to move then towards the impactful actions, we think it might be important to look at these formulations from 3 particular aspects that we chose here. We can definitely discuss the pros and cons of these. The first one is sort of concerns recognition, so that the gender provisions more or less just recognizes that women exist, or that gender can be important. They can use gender pronouns, for example, but it doesn't really specify exactly what is to be achieved. That is the more like the goal oriented. There can actually be more specific sort of aims stated, or there can be mandates to create a specific form of change. So it becomes a bit more concrete on what exactly is to happen. And the final combines a goal with also mechanisms to actually reach towards that goal. So it in a way, to the state parties or to those that are involved in realizing this, it can also signify that there is a sort of higher expectation of that this actually being turned into action. And if we look at different types of gender provisions, there are actually quite a difference between what kind of quality in provision that they make use of. So for example, in terms of recognition, it's hardly a surprise that gender mainstreaming language, those agreements that primarily uses that, tend to have sort of a more of a broader approach to that. And in this, we have sort of drawn out all the 899 provisions that exist in the data set of 105 agreements. And out of those, 602 actually uses primarily language of recognition, which is a broader form. The second one, the goal, this is next second largest one. We have rehabilitation and effective participation, and also mainstreaming, that those kinds of types of gender provision tend to use more of the goal-oriented language. And finally, the smallest category is that on action-oriented language, where the question of rehabilitation is the largest in turn, and followed very closely with effective participation in implementation. So with this, we are not saying in any way that it's always good to have specific goal-oriented or action-oriented provisions. As we discussed earlier, there are different kinds of provisions that aim for different forms of transformative processes. But we still think that it's important to take note of the fact that very few provisions meet all three criteria in terms of aiming specifically and with specific mechanism attached to a specific form of change. Particularly if we then put it in the context of this being bureaucratic and political processes, that where the system is not only going to have to understand what it should be achieving. I've been working for 10 years on gender mainstreaming, and quite often one of the problems is that the capacity isn't high enough to understand what exactly broader gender mainstreaming language means, for example. So it can be an important signaling factor that the language is specific. And also in terms of more specific language also makes it easier to follow up. So it might be an interesting research question, and an interesting thing to discuss is, are the goal and action oriented more easy, for example, for the women's organization to keep up the pressure on the state and the former warring parties to actually realize the gender provision, because it becomes more apparent what is actually sort of taking place. And in this, it's also important to note that we are also not saying that the action-oriented requires specific mechanisms for gender provisions. It can be that these provisions specify exactly how the gender aspect is to be integrated in the core implementation mechanisms that already exist. So, and we also think that this is an important aspect. For example, Madhav and I have a paper where we actually find that it's actually the larger, broader reforms that seem to have a positive effect on women's reforms, women's human rights overall, so or political rights overall. So the question of sort of how women get access and how gender enters into the core decision-making processes is a critical aspect in terms of the broader effects. But also, if we also want to use the full potential of gender provisions, as we know that there are challenges here in terms of implementation, I think we also argue that thinking more about the language and how to get to more specific language should be part of what the Security Council has sort of asked for in terms of moving towards more impactful action. So I also therefore really look forward to hearing Rosa's and Rebecca's presentation of how you work with this very specifically in Colombia. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you also for making precisely that connection between your presentation and Rebecca's and Rosa's presentation, because precisely looking at the way that these gender provisions have been implemented is their presentation. It's called takeaways from implementation of gender commitments in Colombia. And what they have done for us is put together their different insights based on their experience. Rebecca is a specialist on the gender approach. She works with the Kroc Institute, the Barometer Initiative in Colombia. And Rosemilia is a political coordinator, at the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Action. So she comes much more from the side of civil society organizations. And I'm very thankful for the two of them that have combined their insights and share their differentiated experiences. Thank you. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josefina. So Rosa and Amelia and I, we're going to use these 10 minutes to highlight 5 key ideas with regards to our reflections from our work on the implementation of the gender commitments or gender provisions in the Colombian Peace Accord. And November marks 4 years from the signing, and it will be 4 years of our experience working on the implementation of these gender provisions. As Josefina mentioned, it's important to acknowledge that while we have different roles, Rosa Amelia is an incredible woman who has spent her life really working to promote women's rights in Colombia. She was part of the delegation at the negotiation table in Havana, and also works with civil society. And I work, as Josefina mentioned, with the Kroc Institute, where we have a mandate in the peace agreement to provide technical support for the implementation of the peace agreement. So whilst we have these different roles, we have this common goal around supporting the implementation of women's rights in the Colombian Peace Accord. And we asked ourselves 2 questions. First of all, how we see the implementation of the process, the implementation process in Colombia as far as the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And then also, what lessons have we learned, not only for other processes, but also for our own process here in Colombia, and how the future looks. So I'm going to share my screen and share the screen so that we can just build on these 5 ideas. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to see. Can you see okay? I hope so. So our first idea that we want to talk through is just about how we understand implementation. So the accord includes several spaces, mechanisms, and not only for third parties, but also for civil society monitoring. So we know that the parties to the accord, the government and the FARC, they have their own process for monitoring the implementation, the UN mission, the Kroc Institute, there's an international component, and various civil society and women's organizations also produce reports and monitor implementation. We don't always have a common understanding of what we should be measuring, of how we should be measuring it, but that's okay, you know, and that's something we want to measure here, we want to talk about first here, which is about how sometimes really there are tensions around what this monitoring means, and specifically the monitoring of the gender provisions, whether it's about the actions that are taken or whether it's about the impact that implementation has on the lives of women and girls in Colombia, and the importance of understanding and recognizing these different ways of implementing and measuring implementation. The dialogue and discussion, what we've learned in the case of Colombia, is actually really healthy and shows a robust implementation process. It keeps not only the peace agreement and implementation at the center of the political agenda, but it also means that women's rights are at the center of this political agenda. So that's our first lesson. Our second takeaway is around institutional change. So the Colombian Peace Accord, as we mentioned, is more than just laying down of arms. Over 80% of the provisions contain structural reforms. And for these structural reforms, institutions are required to implement. We need institutions to move from politics to policies, and institutions to ensure that these policies include a gender perspective. Often what happens, not only in Colombia, but in other conflict states, there are weak mechanisms and weak institutions nationally and locally as far as delivering women's rights. Little capacity, little understanding, not only technically, but also as far as resources. So in Colombia, we've seen that now that the implementation is at the phase of local implementation, you know, you talk with local mayor's offices with responsibilities. Perhaps they are in parts of the country with huge numbers of internally displaced people, ongoing levels of violence, and to talk to them about how to implement these policies with a gender perspective, we can see that there is often little capacity. So what's happened in Colombia? Positive, the question's moved. The question no longer is why women's rights should be included in these policies, but how to include women's rights in implementation. And that's really important, and international support, as well as good practices from local authorities, has been really, really important in this process. Rosa Emilia, I'm going to pass over to you for our next lesson learned.
So here we are talking about participation, and you know that the conflict in Colombia is also very involving a huge, immense exclusion, especially not only for women, but in general, a very big exclusion that comes towards specifically one in women's Afro-descendant people and indigenous people. And this process was a possibility not only to end with a conflict of a very long time, but also to begin or to give another impulse, like other negotiations, to have some structural changes in the way political behavior, inclusion, and so on so goes inside the country. One of the things that Juanita has mentioned, and that we were sure of that, is that victims were in the center of the negotiations, and we know, as the numbers have been shown, that, and also that we try to do in the participation kind of a summit so women can impulse from civil society in the negotiation very good things. The outcomes are that we have continued maintaining this kind of caucus and different ways of summits to continue participating. But now we are having very high challenges. And I think that one of the lessons we have learned is that we have to have more communication with women all around the country to see all the mechanisms we can have to continue impulsing and understanding the implementation, the times of the implementations, the ways of the implementation. But also that participating in implementation is not only numbers. I think that for us it's so important to see small, whatever, changes in the architecture of the state, so we can see that gender is really being seriously taken, and people that are implementing, they know what they are talking about. They have enough resources to implement what we have already done, because it's very easy to, not easy, but it's very different to impact a negotiation table, to impact so many different places in this moment that have to implement the peace agreement. So now we have another kind of conversation, and we need people in the different places to talk with resources and with knowledge. So Rebecca.
Thank you, Rosa Emilia. Our fourth lesson learned is around partnership and working in partnerships. So the Colombian Peace Agreement within the Accord included roles for civil society, politicians, local NGOs, international donors, community, and there's been support from academics and from really a large range of actors. Where we've seen strong implementation on the gender provisions, it's always been in partnership we've always had civil society and international community supporting the implementation of those provisions. The importance of this partnership, not only for implementation, but also for keeping women's rights on the agenda, and specifically the international agenda. Colombian women have strategically always connected women's rights with peace, have always strategically connected the peace agreement with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and has had, you know, a lot of support from the international community as far as linking the peace agreement with Colombia's commitments for CEDAW, and that's been very powerful, connecting the local, national and international agendas. So what have we learned from this partnership work and the importance of including partnership mechanisms within the peace agreement? First of all, as we just said, you know, we have to build these spaces and mechanisms into the peace agreement. So one of the spaces we've seen that's been really useful has been the international component for monitoring the gender provisions, and that's included Sweden, an international INGO, FEDIM, as well as UN Women, and that's provided a lot of resources and have provided a real focus. The second lesson learned as far as partnerships is how do we link funding, international funds, to women's rights and women's organisations within the WPS agenda. And we could see a lot more of this tying funding for implementation to women's rights. Rosa Emilia.
Well, we also think that in this moment, after previously to the peace agreement and after the peace agreement, we have this huge moment of the no and all what has been called the polarization in the Colombian process. So, and we also have not only all the problems that are concerned with the peace agreement and the negotiation, but there are a lot of impacts in exclusion because, as we have said before, the peace agreement gave the space, so many of the demands of society came out with a lot of strength. So now we have many demands, or the society are demanding many things that are in the line of the agreement, but also are in a wider line of what peace means and democracy and inclusion means for Colombia. So this tension between what is in the agreement and what is as an aspiration of the society in Colombia are coming together, and that means that we are having a lot of cultural transformations. This cultural transformation means that we are arising new types of citizenship and that we are talking about new issues that were not so clear during the peace negotiation, but now are more clear in the peace implementation. For example, we are talking about a gender focus, but a gender intersectional non-racist implementation, for example. So it gets complex because now people, and we are all thinking more about implementation as a way of structural democracy and inclusiveness processes that have been opened in this time. So I think that one of the main lessons that we have in this moment is that we need to talk more between civil society, and we have to change a lot of ideas of how we can agree between us and how we can address women's peace and gender, women's peace and security agenda in a wider way. How we are challenging the agenda because it's not enough for now. It's not enough for us now because now we are looking to other conflicts, to other ways. So we need to widen the way we understand women's peace and security agenda in the implementation and the agreements between society. These cultural transformations have brought then multi-tensions in society, and we really want to include the openings for cultural questions and visions of women's rights in new country. Today, women are asking questions that before they didn't ask, but we are also even thinking that the kind of state and democracy is not enough in this moment, the way it is shaped for what it means a real sustainable peace and inclusive peace in the country. So many questions have arisen now. Rebecca.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rebecca, also for your presentations. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce to you Vera Grave Löwenherz. She is from the Corporation Observatory for Peace, Corporación Observatorio para la Paz, and she's going to be with us speaking about women in between peace agreements and peace building, o la mujer entre acuerdos y construcción de paz. Vera's presentation will bring together her reflections on the development of women's participation in peace building based on her own personal experience during the negotiations of the 1919 M19 peace agreement with the national government of Colombia and the subsequent challenges and opportunities that she has experienced, not just as a peace scholar, but also as congresswoman, diplomat, and peace educator. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a globe that says interpretation. If you just turn on that globe, you're going to be able to hear Vera simultaneously in English because her presentation is going to be in Spanish. So, Vera, por favor, adelante. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Josefina. En primer lugar, agradecer la invitación. En segundo, que me permitan hablar en español porque a pesar de que entiendo, pues no me atrevo a hablar en inglés, pero agradezco como el cuidado y la deferencia que hayan tenido y espero que si hablo muy rápido me digan para que slow down para que sea comprensible lo que voy a compartir. Primero que todo, mi propósito es más hablar desde la experiencia, hablar también un poquito en primera persona, porque creo que la paz también nos atraviesa como personas y en ese sentido hacer reflexiones más desde la propia experiencia. No tengo PowerPoint tampoco, de manera que va a ser más conversadito. No sé si va bien el ritmo. ¿Sí? Bueno.
Sí, nos dice la traductora que vas muy bien, gracias.
Perfecto. Bueno, a lo que me voy a referir es una experiencia que es muy anterior. Cuando oigo aquí todos los análisis, siento que a veces lo que comparto es un poco de prehistoria y de historia antigua, porque voy a hablar de un proceso de paz que ya tiene más de 30 años. Pero ¿por qué me parece importante? Porque a veces se nos olvida que las situaciones, los procesos tienen una historia, que tienen un contexto y que hay que entenderlos en contexto y en perspectiva histórica también. Porque mi experiencia tiene que ver con los procesos de paz de los años 80 y 90, que en gran parte a veces tienden a olvidarse y que fueron antecedentes, creo, importantes para la historia de paz en Colombia. Porque en los años 80 y 90 no existía la 1325, esa herramienta tan importante que tienen hoy los acuerdos de paz. La palabra DDR no se había inventado, de manera que estamos hablando como de unos pasos iniciales en muchos sentidos, pero creo que eso es interesante traerlos acá. Yo fui parte del movimiento guerrillero M19 y lo nombro porque es una experiencia muy diferente o un poco diferente a las demás experiencias guerrilleras, porque se explica, y eso tiene que ver con el tema de mujer, porque es un grupo que rompe los esquemas de la guerrilla tradicional y en ese sentido las mujeres estuvimos siempre presentes. Es decir, en la fundación estuvimos las mujeres, lo cual no quiere decir que no hayan existido machismos o cultura patriarcal, porque finalmente eso está presente y la guerra es patriarcal. Y me acuerdo un compañero que era muy promotor de nosotras las mujeres, del lugar de las mujeres, pero que a veces me decía que yo debía hablar con voz de hombre en las formaciones militares, y entonces era un poco paradójico porque la mujer, pero finalmente nos tenemos que meter en un esquema. Y creo que las mujeres fuimos en esa experiencia, no conocíamos la palabra género, no teníamos esas herramientas conceptuales que existen hoy, pero de alguna manera desde el sentimiento de rebeldía, de justicia, de democracia, pues siempre tratamos de ocupar un lugar internamente y externamente, o sea, internamente en las filas, pero también en la organización, pero también hacia afuera. Y eso tiene que ver con los acuerdos de paz. Primero, el primer acuerdo fue en el año 84, que fue un acuerdo de tregua y diálogo nacional que se firmó con el gobierno de Belisario Betancur, y ahí se creó una comisión de diálogo. Y ahí las mujeres cumplimos un papel, no por decisión del gobierno ni por acuerdo, sino por el lugar que ocupábamos. Y entonces éramos las encargadas de velar por la tregua, de impulsar el gran diálogo nacional, que era toda una movilización política del país en desarrollo, pero ese acuerdo de paz finalmente se rompe gravemente y solamente retomamos la paz en el año 90. Por eso ahora uno de los que me antecedió en la palabra hablaba desde el 89, me parece importante hacer referencia a los acuerdos de paz desde esa época. En el año 90, también ese proceso de paz que inició el M19, fue un proceso de diálogo directo con el gobierno. No tuvimos mediación internacional ni nacional. Es decir, era un diálogo directo con mecanismos de participación. Y cuando Josefina me dijo que cómo me iba a presentar, ella puso negociadora, y yo no fui negociadora, porque no tuvimos las mujeres, y no porque nos sacaran, sino no teníamos un lugar definido como negociadoras, participábamos del proceso. Tuvimos una compañera que se creó un mecanismo de 12 voceros durante el proceso de negociación, mientras el grueso de la fuerza estaba en el campamento en el Cauca, había un grupo de voceros y había una vocera, y ella tenía la inmensa tarea de hablar con los militares, es decir, generar un clima distinto con los militares con los cuales el M19 había tenido una confrontación muy fuerte. Entonces ahí no hubo un rol definido. Es decir, el tema mujer como parte constitutiva en términos normativos del proceso no hubo. No fuimos negociadoras, pero tuvimos un lugar, y las mujeres mismas decidimos conformar una especie de movimiento que se llamó Mujeres de Abril, para decir, bueno, nosotras tenemos que cumplir un papel clave en la paz. Las mujeres, incluso tuvimos críticas de compañeras nuestras que decían que eso era absurdo, que las mujeres buscaran hacer rancho aparte, buscaran hacer su propio movimiento cuando el problema era la democracia. Es decir, incluso, y por eso es tan importante el contexto, el tema de género, yo lo aprendí con el proceso de paz, porque aprendimos con el proceso de paz del movimiento de mujeres, lo cual es muy importante, y no era un tema, el tema era la democracia. Y algunas que nos atrevimos como a hacer algo en ese sentido, pues éramos como un poco exóticas en ese momento, ¿cierto? Pero obviamente así son los caminos así hay que hacer las cosas. Y realmente en ese esquema de negociación de las 7 organizaciones armadas de los años 90, 94, no había negociadoras mujeres. Después muchas mujeres lo reclamaron, pero es que así fue, así fue. Sin embargo, Carlos Pizarro y la jefatura del M19 decidió que las mujeres teníamos que cumplir un papel líder en la política. Entonces yo fui elegida como congresista única en el año 90, sin experiencia, sin ninguna experiencia, llegué sola al Congreso y empecé a mover alguna especie de agenda mujer, pero en torno a temas como la maternidad, y me acuerdo que las políticas liberales me decían que eso no era nada nuevo, que era lo revolucionario que estábamos trayendo, y yo les decía, pero es que estamos trayendo lo que ustedes, los partidos tradicionales, no han hecho, que son los derechos básicos para la población. Esto lo empato con el momento crucial, con el que empata esto, que es la Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, que es el gran hito de esos acuerdos de paz, donde las mujeres excombatientes nos sumamos al movimiento de mujeres que empezó a mover el tema de los derechos. Es decir, y yo creo que eso marca un hito muy importante porque ahí empatan las agendas, ¿cierto? Y obviamente también en el DDR se fueron dando, en el programa de reinserción, también se empezaron a dar pinitos en sentido de temas de salud reproductiva, de salud específica, y ahí es donde se da como pero sobre todo es en la Constitución donde se da esa posibilidad de transformación. Después de la Constituyente se revocó el Congreso existente y yo quedé cabeza de lista para el Senado y obtuvimos en Senado y Cámara 23 parlamentarios. Éramos la 10ª parte. Y ahí yo hice un ejercicio político. ¿Por qué lo traigo aquí? No por contarles la historia de mi vida, sino porque el ejercicio político creo que es mucho más de cuántas mujeres estamos. Eso también es importante, por supuesto. Cierto que no seamos la minoría siempre, pero ¿qué tipo de política hacemos? Y parte de mi frustración en el ejercicio político en el Senado es que yo aspiraba que la paz atravesara la política, que no fuera un discurso y que hubiese una cultura política diferente, porque se esperaba que una exguerrillera llegara con un discurso, escupiera fuego más o menos. Y yo decía, no, pero es que tenemos que generar una política distinta porque la política es un campo casi que una continuación a veces de la guerra. Y así lo viví y por eso renuncié también a estar en ese espacio porque es un espacio donde obviamente salen todos los egos, sale toda la competencia y algunas mujeres no queremos estar compitiendo ahí a pulso por esto y porque de alguna manera yo sí creo que la política, la cultura política tiene que transformarse y tiene que estar atravesada por la paz. Es decir, lo que vivimos hoy en Colombia en términos políticos es la polarización. Una cosa es la diferencia, pero lo otro son los niveles de polarización que realmente impiden pensar, porque todo es manejado desde las emociones. Y entonces creo que eso tiene que ver también con la participación de las mujeres y vale también para los hombres. Es decir, qué tipo de política queremos agenciar, ¿cierto? De manera que, y uno de mis grandes hallazgos, y por eso me alegra tanto estar en este panel, fue encontrarme con algo que se llama investigación para la paz y pedagogía paz. Y yo no conocía eso, yo había echado discursos de la paz, pero estudiar la paz, es decir, ahondar en eso es algo muy importante porque amplía muchísimo el horizonte. Y creo que ese es un campo muy importante al cual estoy dedicado en los últimos 20 años porque creo que es ahí donde se genera lo que Rosa Emilia ahora hablaba de la transformación cultural. Es decir, sin negar los otros espacios, el encontrar que la paz implica transformación cultural de nuestra sociedad, que implica desmontarnos de las lógicas violentas, es que finalmente eso es lo que la hace duradera, es esencial. Y creo que eso no se entendió muy bien en los acuerdos durante la firma del proceso de paz en gobierno de FARC. Se pensó que pedagogía de paz era explicar los acuerdos. Y pedagogía de paz es algo mucho más grande porque implica realmente transformar mentalidades y que la gente apropie la paz en su vida cotidiana. Y eso incluye el tema de género. O sea, es un gran logro que en Colombia, en mi época, género no existía, eso no sabíamos qué es. Pero que el género esté en el centro del debate de la paz, que haya habido una comisión dedicada al tema género y mujer, yo creo que es un avance inmenso, que hay que valorar muchísimo, a pesar de todos los retrasos que pueda tener ese acuerdo, ¿cierto? Porque creo que finalmente es ahí donde se expresa la democracia, ahí es donde se expresa la paz. Y entonces creo que finalmente, y por eso pienso que es muy importante, nosotros no tuvimos la 1325 y pues, ni sabíamos, de pronto no se necesitaba, por las particularidades del proceso, pero hoy hay unas herramientas fundamentales y entonces, y además que creo que no salieron de la nada. Todo esto obedece a todos los esfuerzos que ha hecho el movimiento de mujeres, la sociedad civil, las propias mujeres excombatientes, lo que hemos hecho a nivel educativo que implica darle un nivel diferente a este tema. De manera que creo que es muy importante ver un poco en perspectiva histórica lo que ha pasado en estos años, ¿cierto? Sin negar lo que aportaron los procesos inicialmente, pero también hoy lo que se ha ganado y los retos inmensos que hay, porque obviamente el acuerdo actual se mueve en un contexto político muy distinto al que tuvimos en los años 90, que fue mucho más benévolo, mucho más abierto. A nosotros nos recibieron muy bien, pero hoy realmente es casi un ejercicio de resistencia mantener los acuerdos y en ese tema, obviamente, el tema de género y mujeres esencial. De manera que creo que, insisto también lo que decía Rosa Emilia o decían las compañeras, que el tema esencial es transformación cultural. Si no hay transformación cultural, si no cambiamos mentalidad, pues difícilmente también la paz se vuelve duradera, porque la implementación implica también generar un ambiente, implica también la transformación de nosotros mismos, bajarnos de nuestras lógicas de violencia y aclimatar la paz en sentido integral. Eso sería. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Vera. Thank you very much. I will just now open the Q&A session. If I may ask the presenters of the second panel to turn on your cameras. I have a question for each of you, but of course I encourage all of you to also speak to each other like Vera was just doing. And I want to start with a question that we received in advance to this panel. And I would like to ask this question to Madhav. How important is it to update and upgrade peace agreements from time to time? And what are the possible ways towards this direction? So is it, when you look at peace accord implementation research, is it common? Is it normal to update the agreements? How do you see this from a researcher's perspective?
That's a very good questions, and most of the time those are the questions we actually get from the parties who are part of the agreement, because they always want to change something, right? It's a quite common, I mean, I would say that it happens in two different ways. First, they negotiate partial subsequent agreements because there was some ambiguity in the peace accord on how to implement certain things, or they have forgotten something. Then they go back to negotiation table and then try to resolve those issues. It's mutually done. It's not one side. The another one is the implementation process itself. That the Darwinian process kicks in. Some process gets a lot of attentions in terms of resources, in terms of actors and agencies, and those provisions get implemented quite remarkably than the others, and others are left out. Like, for example, think about economic power sharing as one of the provisions being negotiated in the agreement. But if the agreement also includes autonomy, with autonomy you already have that built in that one, so you really don't have to worry about the economic dimensions of that particular peace accord. So there are a lot, we would say that there are a lot of complementarity, and parties during the negotiation process tend to negotiate more so that they are kind of hedging. If something falls apart, then you have something to latch on, so that you still get some reforms that you initially wanted.
Thank you, Madhav. I have here a question that we just received from the audience today, from Nicole, for Rosemilia and Rebecca. Which strategies have been effective for Colombian women's civil society in pushing for policy change during implementation? And a second one, what in your mind are some of the benefits of public actions such as protests and campaigns versus quieter behind the scenes lobbying? For example, unofficial consultations, individual meetings with conflict parties, etc.
You want to begin, Rebecca, or you want me to begin?
Go first, Rosa Emilia, and I'll compliment you.
Okay. May I speak in Spanish?
Yo creo que tenemos a nuestra traductora. Yes, if you speak in Spanish, I would just ask the audience to turn on the interpretation button again. Thank you.
Please, thank you. Bueno, yo creo que la pregunta, voy a seguir el ejemplo de Vera de hablar en castellano, que me parece mucho más cómodo. Gracias, Vera. Miren, yo creo que en el movimiento colombiano no escogemos una sola línea de trabajo. Yo creo que hay muchas formas en que se expresa la sociedad civil. Y nosotras hemos aprendido en gran medida a poder hacer desayunos, consultas que no son oficiales, lo que llaman ustedes el minuto en el ascensor. Hemos aprendido muchísimo de todo ese tipo de lobby, pero no renunciamos a la protesta. Creemos que como ciudadanas y ciudadanos tenemos derecho a la protesta, tenemos derecho a salir a la calle, tenemos derecho a reclamar los derechos. Entonces, en general, creo que dependiendo del tipo de conversación que se tenga, se tiene estas reuniones o el lobby que tengamos que hacer, pero también en algunos momentos es importantísima la expresión ciudadana. Voy a poner un ejemplo después del no. Ahí tuvimos una marcha inmensa que fue muy promovida por los jóvenes y que fue la marcha de las velas y del silencio. Esa marcha hizo que nosotras y nosotros pudiéramos salir del golpe tan brutal que tuvimos después del referéndum y del no. Entonces hacemos cosas. Yo quiero decir además que en experiencias como las que planteó Vera, en esa conversación que se tuvo en múltiples negociaciones en Colombia, es que todas hemos aprendido a hacer lobby de otras maneras y nos dio el resultado del trabajo con la negociación de las FARC. Entonces yo diría algo que no dije antes, Rebeca, que me parece que es clave, y es que en las negociaciones con las FARC, las víctimas fueron el centro, pero en la implementación, la sociedad civil es la clave. Es la sociedad civil la que hace que se mantenga un acuerdo o no. Y creo que es fundamental que la sociedad civil de las mujeres pueda mantener el acuerdo en perspectiva de implementación. Rebeca.
Gracias, Rosa. Yeah, and just to complement, I think from what I've seen, one of the main areas is around peace education. I think that knowing the agreement has been absolutely key for women's organisations. It doesn't mean that women's organisations has changed their agenda, but they've really done a lot of work sharing the peace accord with local organisations and with women around the country so that women know how to use the peace agreement as a tool for demanding their rights, you know? And so I think one thing, you know, we've seen that as far as specifically, I'll give a specific example. There's measures for the guarantees for protection and security of women. Now this has been, you know, years in Colombia, this has been an issue. So what women did when this came into the peace agreement and women ensured that this language, there was a gender perspective to these security guarantees for leaders, for human rights defenders in the Colombian peace accord. And so what women did said, look, we've got a program, you know, that's been before that we want to implement. And this is the way we want to implement the peace agreement. And that speaks to the strength of the civil society movement. That speaks to the strength of the women's movement in Colombia. But I think that's been absolute key, is this peace education and linking the peace agreement to women's existing agendas.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Gracias, Rosa. Thank you, Rebecca. I also have received a question that I would like to pose to Luis. And one of our registrants said, how do factors such as regional placement, cultural traditions and beliefs, and existing treatment of women play into the success of the WPS agenda during implementation. And I think this resonates very well with what you were talking about before on how the demands during the negotiation process get kind of translated then in different sort of provisions in the agreements.
So a very good question and a very difficult one. I think it's also, I should be upfront and say it's sort of on the outskirts of what I've been specializing in. But I think it's, if I can reflect on that from one particular angle, I think that the way that that question has developed as I've seen it over the last 20 years has been, from the beginning, I think they were quite often put in sort of opposition to each other, right? So there was sort of different identities were played out against each other. So it was women against ethnic minorities or other sort of identity markers. I think what research has shown since then is that many of these discriminatory sort of attitudes tend to go a bit together. They are not as always as linked as maybe sometimes we talk about them now, but they do affect each other. So I think there's an article coming out now by Carl Beersley, for example, that look at, so how does, for example, fighting ethnic discrimination relate to fighting gender discrimination? It actually seems like fighting gender discrimination can actually support also working against ethnic discrimination. So these processes seem to talk to each other. There's not an either or trade-off necessarily, but they definitely need to be weighed. And I think into that also comes the question of intersectionality. Of course, women are represented by ethnic minorities as well, so the gender equality aspect can also cut across different kinds of other forms of discrimination. So it's, I think like Marita and Rosa Emilia and Rebecca has really shown, this is quite a complex issue that goes about sort of negotiating a very long-term transformation in society where there's no easy quick fix, but we should also not take them as being in opposition necessarily.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you. We have another one here from our Q&A for Vera, Rosemilia, and Rebecca. We'll ask Vera to reply first. Do you think the Colombian Congress is supporting what was agreed regarding gender issues in the implementation of the peace agreement?
¿Qué dice la pregunta?
Mira, te preguntan que si piensas que el Congreso colombiano está apoyando lo que se acordó en relación con los temas o el enfoque de género en la implementación del acuerdo final.
Pues el Congreso es un debate permanente y de fuerzas a favor y fuerzas en contra. Yo creo, si yo comparo de nuevo con cuando yo fui senadora, el tema ni existía, nosotros creamos una unidad legislativa, hoy el tema está posicionado y yo creo que hoy necesariamente tiene que referirse. Ahora, que el Congreso en su conjunto sea el que tenga la iniciativa, pues sabemos que el Congreso es un espacio de tensiones y de posturas encontradas, gente a favor del acuerdo, gente en contra. Entonces no se puede ver como un todo solamente, sino también como las fuerzas que se mueven ahí. Por lo tanto, es una lucha. Yo creo que a veces se nos olvida que todo esto está atravesado por conflictos, por luchas, por fuerzas, por actores. La implementación de un acuerdo no es un papel, ni es solamente la norma, sino eso se traduce necesariamente en una sociedad que en el caso colombiano hoy está polarizada de maneras y se traduce en actores concretos con mentalidades, con visiones, con conflictos, con muchos conflictos. Entonces, yo creo que a veces pensamos que la implementación no pensamos, ustedes lo viven de otra manera, por supuesto, es cómo avanza, pero es que esto está atravesado por conflictividades y yo creo que a veces se pierde de vista quiénes son los actores que juegan ahí. O sea, el contexto político colombiano hoy juega en la implementación de los acuerdos. Un gobierno diferente obviamente sería muy distinto respecto a los acuerdos de paz. Entonces, es como un poco que miremos las tensiones, los conflictos y los actores que están en juego.
Bueno, yo antes de responder quiero hacer una claridad porque es muy importante para nosotras como movimiento de mujeres. Nunca hubo delegadas oficiales del movimiento de mujeres en la mesa de diálogo. Muchas mujeres rotaron y muchas mujeres, por ejemplo, de la cumbre de la cual yo pertenezco, escribimos y hicimos montones de cosas en relación a La Habana. Entonces yo creo que eso es importante porque fue un conjunto de múltiples mujeres las que hicimos un ejercicio de impacto frente a La Habana. Lo segundo, frente al Congreso. Miren, yo creo que es que lo que dice Vera, yo me encuentro mucho con ella en términos de decir, el Congreso es el lugar de las tensiones políticas más complejas que está viviendo el país, uno de los lugares. Sin embargo, yo creo que después, en el segundo momento, después de el no, después de ese momento tan complicado, el Congreso respaldó el acuerdo. Y logramos sacar adelante el fast track de la legislación que posibilitaba la estructuración de todo el proceso de paz con un establecimiento institucional, con lugares, y eso fue fundamental. Ahora en este momento es un lugar de muchísimas tensiones, de muchísimos intereses. Es el lugar del conflicto político, digámoslo, en esos términos, mientras que en otros lugares se evidencian los conflictos de otra manera. Yo creo que la lucha en el Congreso en este momento es muy difícil, dependiendo de los intereses, de quienes hablan, de cómo se mueve, y ahora que vamos a entrar próximamente en un periodo prepresidencial, la situación es bastante compleja y tensa. Creo que a veces no, a veces...
Thank you, Rosa. I think at the very end, we just didn't hear the very last part of your sentence. But Rebecca, if you want to complement.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question is really interesting because it also speaks to the fact that a peace agreement is long-term. You know, and Congress has 4 years and we go through new governments. So we've had new local elections in Colombia last year. We've had new presidential elections in Colombia. And so I think what I'd like to just reflect on is at the end of our presentation, we spoke about this transformation, the cultural transformation. Not only, that also includes politics. You know, so the question there is, I think something important in the Colombian peace process was making the peace agreement a state policy and not just a government policy. So how can, and that's also what Rosa Emilia talks about, is the importance of civil society, you know, constantly, you know, holding the, you know, the flag of implementation, because that really provides accountability. And governments change and congresses change. And so how does the peace agreement, which is long-term, survive that? The only thing in the case of Colombia is that, you know, Colombia has a very low percentage of female or women in politics, elected representatives. And so, you know, that's really hard because it's not just about women's provisions. It's also about women's rights in political participation. I think it's got one of the, you know, lowest percentages in the region in Latin America for elected women politicians. And so the cultural transformations that we're talking about getting women into politics, is not only for the peace agreement, it's actually just for the whole society and has these implications for Congress as well.
Thank you very much. We have just a few last minutes, so I'm just going to look at my presenters. I have 2 more questions from the audience. The first one would be to Madhav, and let me see, it's from Polly Martinez Centered. For Madhav, if during the Cold War, very little to none agreements were made, so were agreed upon, maybe reflecting two political views of society. When the Cold War ends and agreements arise, does that mean that without two ruling political forces, new dialogues and agreements are possible?
That looks like, certainly the case, but we also have to be very careful. During the Cold War, most of the negotiation process were, kind of, fast track, happening between the head of the states or things like that. But after the Cold War, that changed dramatically. We have more mediators, more civil society participation. And there is a more, push towards finding negotiated solutions after that. And when you have a lot of technical resources like this, support like this is available, then there is a tendency then to go and try that, right? That's why it is important to see that distinctions. What happened during the Cold War and what happened after the Cold War. And in my slide, you probably saw that since 2010, the tendency is peace agreement negotiation is in downward trend. Of course, after 2010, we see the Colombian peace process, we see the Bangsamoro peace process, we also see the South Sudanese peace process, but at the same time, the number of armed conflict increased, and you can see the sense of polarized world after 2010, and not being able to negotiate more peace agreement and resolve more conflict. It is precisely because so much polarizations between the West and the Russian and then the Chinese also coming on international arena now. So
thank you, Madhav. I have a very interesting question that we just received from Christopher, and maybe with this we can just invite all our panelists from the first and the second panel just to help us with shedding some light on what you think about this. I was wondering, says the question, if there is a contradiction between efficiency and a more transformative or radical approach to the implementation process. Or may the prospects of social change, including justice of women and indigenous groups, add energy and support to the process? So do they add energy and support the process? How do you see all this? And I just open the floor for all the panelists to share with us your views. Juanita.
Thank you. Just a few comments. In my experience, when the victims started to visit the main table, the peace talks, it was a reality check. So when you are in these highly technical, politicized, antagonist discussions between parties, you get so immersed in the discussion. So when the victims came and then tell you many things in your face, then you get this reality check and really push hard on the negotiation. And that reminds us all the time to focus on the main issue. And in the case of Colombia was to have the victims of the center and know that everything that we were doing there was for all Colombians, not the FARC, not the government, not the military forces, but everybody. So having these exchanges also with the civil society, when they visited the Gender Commission of the Ceasefire Commission, it was this kind of energy. Also in Spanish is jalada de orejas. You get all of this punishment and this hard energy, and it was really, really important in that process. That's my understanding in negotiation.
Maybe just to complement, if I can, I think it's a really, really great question. I think, you know, as the question asks, it's this justice is this deep, profound change, you know, it's partly the cause of the conflict. It addresses, you know, the deep exclusion that has been experienced by the population, the Colombian population. And I think there is this tension between, I think the peace agreement in Colombia did benefit from sort of short-term wins as far as implementation. I think that the fact that the disarming, the laying down of the arms, the process, you know, the beginnings of reincorporation went really smoothly. I think that was really important because I think it is important to have these short-term wins. But these processes of justice, while they're long-term, the foundations need to be laid in the short term. And so I think that's where, although sometimes we look at impact and we're still waiting for a lot of these impact to happen as far as the cultural transformation, what we need to remember is those foundations need to be laid in the short term. And so we should never, you know, how do we keep looking for short-term wins, but at the same time laying those long-term foundations?
Excellent. Rosa.
I think that for Colombia, and going back to history, we have had so many negotiations, and we have so many rebel groups, and we have when Beta was talking about the changes that were done during the Constitutional Act, and all the things that changed, and how women had the space to go inside the constitutional reform and bring on board our rights and so on. So every time we have this kind of negotiations, we think that we are going to have a broader agenda after the negotiation. Because if we don't have that broader agenda, then we are talking about a peace that is only silencing the arms, but not a peace that is changing society. And I think that nowadays, peace agreements have to change societies. If not, they are not worthy enough, because they are not really moving the way the civil society are expecting to be moved. And interests are not touched, and things are not happening really. It's what we call a negotiation between elites, but not a negotiation that will really move society in a way, in a deeper way, for rights, for necessities, and for really having a cultural change in the way of being better human beings and better citizens.
Vera.
Entiendo, la pregunta es si los cambios radicales ayudan a las negociaciones. La pregunta es qué entendemos por radical, porque en el caso del grupo al que pertenecí, se dice que somos radicales, pero nosotros luchábamos por la democracia, con las armas. O sea, el radicalismo tiene que ver o con las ideas políticas o con los métodos. Entonces, yo considero que por eso a mí hoy no me gusta mucho a veces esas actitudes como vergonzantes de considerar que todo fue un error, ¿cierto? Que quienes nos levantamos en armas contra un régimen injusto, cerrado, antidemocrático, cometimos un gran error y debemos arrepentirnos. Yo creo que no se hubiera dado la Constitución de 91 si no hubiéramos hecho esa lucha. Que ahí hubo errores, que hubo dificultades, claro que sí. Y la gente misma nos dijo, sálganse de la guerra, y nos salimos de la guerra para evitar víctimas. Pero si no se hubieran dado esas luchas, y no hablo solo de Colombia, el señor Mandela también fue un rebelde. Es decir, la rebeldía, lo que pasa es que cuando se mete todo en la idea de conflicto armado, que obviamente existe, se olvida que quienes tomamos esas opciones no fue porque nos gustara la violencia, sino porque había regímenes cerrados injustos, como los hubo en otros siglos, en otros contextos. Entonces creo que ese tipo de luchas abrieron conjuntamente con la sociedad, por supuesto, por eso es tan importante la sociedad civil, y por eso la sociedad civil fue la que nos dijo, sálganse de la guerra. Pero creo que si hay ciertas luchas que no se hubieran hecho, no tendríamos los cambios, como es el caso de la nueva Constitución. Es decir, hoy yo estoy en la paz totalmente, en la no violencia, obviamente, y la lucha armada se ha deslegitimado, pero uno no puede, creo que, caer en la visión ahistórica de considerar más o menos que eso no debió pasar, ¿cierto? Yo creo que por eso es tan importante una lectura contextual y hacer claridad en ese sentido, ¿cierto? Es decir, una cosa que hoy estés en la paz, pero eso no significa que invalides todo lo que hiciste con errores y todo, por supuesto.
Thank you very much, everyone. I would like to close now our webinar. There have been a lot of opinions, a lot of diversity of research perspectives and experiences here. I want to turn to Luis, my co-convener, to see if there's something you would like to add before we close. And I thank you all, everyone, for participating and staying with us until the end.
I just want to I think for me that the final question and the final discussions really revolve around that we today are moving towards a much better understanding of women's political power and agency in a way that I don't think we possibly have before. And there's a new research project coming out by Erika Chenoweth and Zoe Marks that really shows sort of the impact of women's mass mobilization for the regular political processes and the effects that has on both democracy and sort of more peaceful changes and as well as violent changes over time. So I think that it really sort of connects us to the broader political understanding of women's agency. So I think it was a very, very good question to end with. So before I hand you the last word, Josefina, let me just thank you for having this opportunity to collaborate with you on this fantastic event. We have really appreciated that.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a wonderful day. And let's keep in touch and continue talking about the WPS. Good night.